Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Ashwalkers. This is a horror story about the Makhai, and in this story, a border fortress in an ancient, forgotten territory. The army isn't fighting a war. They are guarding a silent zone where ancient volcanic vents leak a strange, iridescent gas. The soldiers are bored and complacent, treating the legends of the Makhai as bedtime stories used to keep recruits disciplined. The second story today is called The Inversion at Kurozawa Valley. This is a horror story about the Ushioni. And in this story, a deniable assets unit specializing in biological anomalies is deployed to a remote, fog-shrouded valley in the Japanese Alps. Local villagers report the water turning black and livestock vanishing without a trace. The team tracks the creature to a series of interconnected waterfalls and deep, stagnant pools. The environment is claustrophobic, slick rocks, hanging moss, and a silence so heavy it feels physical. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Ashwalkers. The soldier was screaming a warning to someone who could not hear him because he was already dead, his voice cracking across the fortress courtyard like a whip against stone, his throat raw from sulfur and terror, and the desperate certainty that his words were arriving too late for anyone who still had ears to receive them. "They are coming from below," he shrieked. Though they was wrong, there was only one. There had always been only one, a singularity of destruction wearing the shape of multiplicity. "The vents have opened. The mountain is." And then his warning became a shriek, not of words but of pure biological reaction, as the first limb emerged from the crack that had appeared in the parade ground, a limb not of flesh but of obsidian, faceted and glass-edged, hotter than a forge and blacker than the space between stars. The sound that followed was not a roar but a geological event, the rhythmic wet wheeze of a mountain breathing, of sulfur and grinding stone inhaled and exhaled by lungs that were volcanic chambers, by a heart that was magma. The soldier's warning died in his throat, and his body died a moment later, crushed beneath a foot that was not a foot but a tectonic plate given intention. And the camera, if there had been a camera, if this were a record rather than a memory, would have pulled back then, would have widened to a silent, wide shot of a valley filled with 10,000 corpses, all frozen in a single posture of terror, their arms raised against an enemy that had come not from beyond the borders but from beneath their own feet. But that was later. That was the aftermath, the conclusion, the final frame of a story that had begun in boredom and complacency. Before the scream, before the warning, before the mountain breathed its first breath of war, there had been the fortress and the soldiers, and the silence that was not peace but the pause between heartbeats. The fortress had no name that anyone remembered, though the locals in the villages that clung to the highlands like lichen called it the Black Tooth, a reference to its profile against the sky rather than any military significance. It sat on a ridge overlooking a valley that had been forgotten by cartographers, generals, and historians alike. A valley where ancient volcanic vents leaked a strange iridescent gas that shimmered above the rocks like heat haze in winter. The empire that had built the fortress was gone. Its borders collapsed. Its armies dissolved into the dust of centuries. But the garrison remained because no one had thought to recall them, because the supply lines still functioned with the mechanical indifference of bureaucracy, because the valley was strategically worthless and therefore politically uninteresting. 300 soldiers manned the walls, rotated through in yearly assignments that were considered punishment by ambitious officers and refuge by broken ones. They guarded a silent zone, a stretch of border where nothing had happened in living memory, and where nothing was expected to happen in the foreseeable future. The soldiers were bored. This was the essential truth of the fortress, the fact that underlay every card game, every drinking session, every fistfight in the barracks, and every affair in the supply closets. They were bored with the damp, bored with the cold, bored with the iridescent gas that rose from the vents and made the northern horizon glow with a false aurora. They were bored with the discipline, bored with the rations, bored with each other's faces and stories and bodies. They treated the legends of the Makhai as bedtime stories used to keep recruits disciplined, tales of ancient demons born from volcanic rock and the rage of gods, told by sergeants to ensure that new soldiers did not wander too close to the vents at night. The veterans knew better, or thought they did. They had served their terms, stood their watches, counted the days until rotation, and never seen anything more threatening than a mountain goat or a supply clerk with sticky fingers. The fortress was built of basalt and granite, walls 3 meters thick at the base, tapering to 2 meters at the crenellations, designed to withstand siege engines and battering rams that had not existed for 1,000 years. Its architecture was imperial, functional, devoid of ornamentation except for the reliefs carved above the main gate, figures that the soldiers assumed were heroes of forgotten campaigns, but which Helena, if she had been there, if she had translated the script, would have recognized as warnings. Images of men with 2 heads and 4 arms, wielding weapons of fire and stone, standing astride battlefields where the dead lay in windrows. The soldiers walked beneath these reliefs every day without looking up, without wondering why an empire that had never been attacked in this valley had built a fortress capable of holding off a legion. The protagonist was not among the warriors. His name was Thuron, and he was a logistics officer, a quartermaster's assistant, the lowest rank that still qualified for officer status. He was 23 years old, slight of build, nearsighted in one eye, and possessed of a temperament that had led his superiors to assign him to inventory rather than combat. He counted grain sacks. He tracked the rotation of spear shafts and shield bindings. He maintained the ledgers that recorded how many arrows remained in the armory and how many horseshoes needed reshoeing. He had never killed a man. He had never struck a blow in anger. He had survived childhood illness, a famine, and the draft by being too useful to waste and too insignificant to notice. In the fortress, he was invisible, a gray presence in a gray uniform, moving through the corridors with his ledger under his arm, and his mind occupied with columns of numbers that balanced to 0. Thuron had heard the legends, of course. Everyone had. The Makhai, they were called in the old stories, the spirits of battle, born from the volcanic earth when strife grew strong enough to crack the world. 2-headed, double-torsoed, wielding weapons of magma and obsidian, they appeared wherever hatred became concentrated enough to serve as a beacon, wherever human conflict reached a frequency that resonated with the anger of the mountains. The sergeants told the stories with relish, describing how the Makhai could not be killed by bronze or iron, how they absorbed the violence of the battlefield and grew stronger with every blow struck, every wound opened, every scream torn from a dying throat. They were biological machines, the stories said, designed for one purpose: the perfection of combat, the absolute expression of war without mercy or strategy or end. Thuron had listened to these tales with the same attention he gave to supply manifests, filing them under cultural ephemera and returning to his calculations. He did not believe in monsters. He believed in grain rations and spear tallies and the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that balanced. The morning of the breach began like any other. Reveille at dawn, porridge in the mess hall, assignments distributed by the captain, a man named Draken who had served 20 years in the silent zone and had developed the hollow-eyed stare of someone who had seen too much emptiness and not enough purpose. Draken was a competent officer, neither cruel nor kind, managing the fortress with the mechanical efficiency of a farmer tending a field that produced no crop. He presided over the morning briefing in the command chamber, a room of bare stone and a single window overlooking the valley, where the iridescent gas rose in lazy spirals from the vents that pocked the landscape like pockmarks on a beggar's face. "The eastern wall needs reinforcement," Draken announced, reading from a tablet that Thuron had prepared the night before. "The winter rains have undermined the foundation. Thuron, requisition timber from the highland villages. Offer copper coin. Don't promise anything on credit." "Yes, sir," Thuron murmured, making a note in his ledger. The Southern Watch reports movement in the pass. Probably bandits, possibly refugees. Centurion Phobos, dispatch a patrol but do not engage unless provoked. We are not at war with anyone, and I do not intend to start one. Yes, sir, Phobos rumbled, a heavy man with a beard that reached his chest. And the eastern grain stores are showing spoilage. Thuron, investigate. If the seals are compromised, transfer the remainder to the lower vault. Yes, sir. The briefing concluded, the officers dispersed, and the day settled into its accustomed rhythm. Maintenance, training, guard duty, meals, sleep. Thuron spent the morning in the grain stores, confirming what he already knew. That moisture had penetrated the eastern vault, that perhaps a quarter of the barley was moldy, that the waste would need to be recorded, and the shortfall explained to the quartermaster in the provincial capital, who would not care but would require documentation regardless. He worked in the dim light of a single oil lamp, his fingers sorting through the damp grain, his mind occupied with the mathematics of loss. The argument began at midday. It was not an unusual argument. The fortress bred conflict the way damp walls bred mildew, incessantly and invisibly, until the accumulation became impossible to ignore. This particular conflict involved two high-ranking officers, Centurion Phobos and Tribune Lysander, a man who had arrived 3 months earlier with orders to streamline operations, and an attitude that treated the veterans of the Silent Zone as lazy peasants who needed the discipline of a superior mind. Lysander was young, ambitious, educated in the capital's military academies where war was studied as theory rather than experienced as practice. He wore his armor polished, his hair oiled, his insignia displayed with a precision that Phobos found insulting in a place where polish meant nothing and function meant everything. The argument concerned a map. Lysander had commissioned a new survey of the valley, using instruments and techniques that he claimed were superior to the old markings, and he had discovered, or believed he had discovered, that the fortress's eastern boundary extended 40 meters further than previously recorded. This meant, according to his interpretation, that the iridescent vents, previously considered outside the garrison's responsibility, now fell within their jurisdiction. And jurisdiction, in Lysander's mind, meant exploitation. The vents produced sulfur, sulfur produced alchemical compounds, compounds produced revenue, and revenue produced promotion. Phobos disagreed. The old map, he insisted, had been drawn by the Empire's original surveyors and had stood for centuries. The vents were outside the boundary, had always been outside the boundary, and should remain outside the boundary because nothing good had ever come from disturbing them. The old soldiers' stories, which Phobos told with the gravity of a man who had heard them from his grandfather, warned against the vents, against the gas, against the particular quality of hatred that seemed to rise from the cracks in the earth and infect the minds of those who breathed too deeply. Superstition, Lysander sneered, his voice carrying across the courtyard where Thuron was carrying his grain samples to the command chamber for inspection. The ramblings of ignorant men who attribute natural phenomena to spirits because they lack the education to understand chemistry. The boundary is the boundary, Phobos growled, his hand moving to the sword at his hip, a gesture of habit rather than threat. The vents are cursed. Everyone knows it. Cursed? Lysander laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound that carried across the courtyard. By what? Your grandmother's ghost. The Empire does not recognize curses, Centurion. The Empire recognizes maps and revenues and the initiative of officers who are not afraid to claim what is rightfully theirs. The vents are not yours to claim. According to the old map, perhaps, but the new survey. Your survey is wrong. Your face is wrong, you superstitious oaf. The insult hung in the air, a spark in a room full of tinder. Phobos's face darkened, his hand tightening on his sword hilt, his body shifting into a combat stance that he had learned in a dozen border skirmishes. Lysander did not flinch. He was younger, faster, and armed with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been contradicted by the universe. The other soldiers in the courtyard stopped their work, watching the confrontation with the hungry attention of men who had been bored for too long and welcomed any distraction from the monotony of guard duty. Thuron watched from the doorway of the command chamber, his grain samples forgotten in his hands. He felt the tension in the air, the particular quality of hatred that seemed to thicken when two men who despised each other finally found the excuse to express it. He did not know, could not have known, that this was not merely an argument but a frequency, a vibration, a beacon. He did not know that the old stories were not stories but instructions, that the Makhai did not appear randomly but were summoned, that the essence of Eris was not a metaphor but a measurable force that responded to specific stimuli. He knew only that the courtyard felt wrong, that the air tasted of copper, that the iridescent gas on the horizon seemed to be glowing brighter than it had that morning. The blow was struck by Phobos, a backhanded slap that caught Lysander across the cheek and sent him staggering. Lysander recovered with the speed of a trained fighter, drawing his sword, not the practiced blade but the sharpened steel that he wore for ceremony and intimidation. Phobos drew his own blade, and the courtyard became a circle of violence, the soldiers pressing back to give the combatants room, their faces lit with the terrible joy of spectators who have been granted the spectacle they craved. "Enough!" Captain Draken shouted from the command chamber window, but his voice was lost in the clash of steel, the grunt of exertion, the cheers of the crowd. He descended the stairs, drawing his own weapon, but he was too late. The violence had reached critical mass, the hatred had found its frequency, and the mountain had heard. The ground did not shake, it unfolded. This was the horror of it, the detail that Thuron would remember in the years that followed when he woke screaming in the night. Not the violence of an earthquake, but the deliberation of a flower opening, the volcanic rock beneath the fortress reshaping itself with a geological patience that made the human violence above it seem frantic and absurd. The cracks began in the parade ground, hairline fractures that widened with the slowness of ice breaking on a spring river, and from those cracks rose the gas, not iridescent now but black, thick, heavier than air, pooling around the soldiers' ankles like a tide of ink. The stone of the courtyard began to glow, not from without but from within, as if the basalt itself had developed veins of light, a network of luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the combat above. Phobos and Lysander paused, their swords locked, their faces inches apart, their hatred momentarily eclipsed by confusion. They looked down at the cracks, at the glowing stone, at the black gas that was rising to knee height to waist height, and in their eyes Thuron saw the first flicker of understanding, the terrible comprehension that they had done something that could not be undone. "What is this?" Lysander whispered, his sword wavering. "The vents," Phobos said, and his voice was hollow. "We woke the vents." The unfolding reached its climax not with an explosion but with a birth, the mountain skin splitting along a seam that ran the length of the parade ground, the rock peeling back like a wound, and from the cavity beneath emerged the Makhai. It was not a ghost, not a spirit, not a metaphor given form. It was physical material, a mass of obsidian and magma that rose from the earth with the deliberation of a continent emerging from the sea. The first thing Thuron saw was the heat, a shimmer in the air that made the courtyard waver like a reflection in disturbed water. The second thing he saw was the shape, the geometry of a body that should not have existed. Two torsos, joined at the waist, each torso supporting a head, each head bearing a face that was not a face but a mask of volcanic glass, featureless except for the hollows where eyes should have been, hollows that glowed with the orange of magma seen through smoked lenses. The arms were four, two for each torso, and they were not arms in any human sense, but rather extensions of the volcanic matter, jagged and faceted, ending in hands that were clusters of obsidian shards, each shard sharp enough to shave bone. The legs were pillars of compressed ash, wide and heavy, supporting a weight that must have measured in tons, and where they touched the stone of the courtyard they left impressions that glowed red and smoked with the smell of burning earth. But the worst part, the detail that made Thuron's mind rebel against the evidence of his eyes, was the network of lines that covered the creature's body, pulsing channels that ran from the heads down through the torsos and into the legs, lines that were not veins but open conduits of pressurized molten rock, glowing brighter with each passing second, as if something were pumping them full of liquid fire. The Makhai stood to its full height, perhaps 4 meters tall, its two heads turning in unison to survey the courtyard, the hollow eyes scanning the soldiers who had frozen in attitudes of shock and disbelief. It did not roar. It did not challenge. It simply regarded with the patient attention of a predator who has found its prey gathered conveniently in one place and sees no reason to hurry. Then it moved. The first blow fell on Phobos and Lysander, who still stood with their swords locked, their argument forgotten, their hatred rendered irrelevant by the appearance of something that made their conflict microscopic. The Makhai's upper right arm swept down in an arc that seemed lazy, almost casual, and caught both men with the force of a falling tree. Phobos's sword shattered against the obsidian shards. Lysander's breastplate crumpled like parchment. They were thrown across the courtyard, their bodies bouncing off the fortress wall with wet sounds that Thuron would hear in his dreams forever. And when they hit the ground they did not move, their forms reduced to composites of armor and bone and blood that steamed in the cold air. The slaughter began in earnest. Thuron did not see all of it. He would piece together the details later, from the fragments of memory that survived his terror, from the accounts of other survivors who had hidden in closets and latrines in the spaces between walls. But he saw enough. He saw the Makhai move through the courtyard with the systematic efficiency of a farmer thrashing grain, its 4 arms rising and falling, each blow crushing a skull or splitting a spine or tearing a torso in half. He saw the lava lines pulse, saw the pressurized molten rock spray from the creature's wounds, for the soldiers did wound it, their swords and spears striking the obsidian skin and chipping fragments that fell to the ground like black glass, each chip accompanied by a gout of blood that was not blood but magma, 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, igniting everything it touched. A soldier struck the creature's leg and was sprayed across the face, his head vanishing in a burst of steam and flame, his body continuing to stumble for 3 steps before collapsing. He saw the shields raised, the formations attempted, the desperate courage of men who had been trained to fight humans and found themselves facing a geological event. The Makhai's lower torso managed the crowd, its arms sweeping in wide arcs that broke shields and shattered spears, that sent bodies flying in sprays of blood that hissed and steamed where they touched the creature's superheated skin. The upper torso executed precise, lethal strikes, its hands punching through armor with the accuracy of a surgeon, finding the gaps between plates, the vulnerabilities of joints, the soft tissues of throats and groins and armpits. It was a tactical nightmare, a creature that fought on 2 levels simultaneously, the general and the assassin, the battering ram and the stiletto. The horror peaked when the soldiers realized that their weapons were not merely ineffective but counterproductive. Every blow struck against the Makhai's charred skin, every chip of obsidian, every spray of magma blood seemed to feed it, to make it larger, more stable, more present. The creature absorbed the violence of the battle the way a sponge absorbs water, growing with each death, its lava lines pulsing brighter, its movements becoming more fluid, more practiced, more joyful. The battlefield became a buffet of adrenaline and agony, and the Makhai feasted. Thuron ran. He did not remember deciding to run. He remembered standing in the doorway of the command chamber, his grain samples spilled across the threshold, his ledger fallen from nerveless fingers, and then he was moving not toward the gate. The gate was chaos. The gate was death. The gate was where the Makhai had emerged and where it still prowled, but toward the interior of the fortress, toward the cellars, toward any hole deep enough to hide him from the thing that had risen from the earth. He ran through corridors that echoed with screams, past rooms where soldiers were barricading doors that would not hold, past windows that framed scenes of carnage like paintings in a gallery of atrocity. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs shook, and his mind retreated to a place beyond thought, a place where there was only motion and the desperate hope that the next corner would offer salvation. He found the cellar by accident, by falling. The stairway to the lower levels was hidden behind a tapestry in the command chamber's anteroom, a passage used for storage rather than defense, and he tumbled down it in the darkness, his body bouncing off stone steps, his hands clawing at walls that were slick with damp and cold. He hit the bottom in a heap, his ankle twisted, his vision swimming with stars, and lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds from above. The thunder of the Makhai's footsteps, the crash of collapsing masonry, the screams that were becoming fewer and more distant as the population of the fortress dwindled. The cellar was small, perhaps 3 meters square, used for storing salt and winter vegetables in barrels that had long since emptied. The walls were rough stone, weeping with moisture that tasted of minerals and decay. The floor was dirt, packed hard by centuries of use, and in one corner there was a channel through which water ran, a natural spring that fed the fortress's cisterns above. The water was ice-cold mountain melt that had filtered through leagues of bedrock, and it pooled around Thuron's legs as he lay gasping, seeping through his clothes, numbing his skin, grounding him in a physical reality that seemed impossibly distant from the horror above. He crawled to the center of the cellar, pressing himself against the wall beneath the stairs, his body curled into a ball, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the sounds of slaughter filtered through the floorboards like water through a sieve. He was trapped. The stairway was the only exit, and the stairway led to the courtyard, and the courtyard was the Makhai's hunting ground. He had not survived through bravery. He had survived through insignificance, through being too small to notice, through running while others stood to fight. He was a logistics officer, a counter of grain sacks, and he had found his appropriate refuge in a hole beneath the earth, watching the massacre through the cracks in the floorboards. The cracks were narrow, barely wide enough to admit a finger, but they admitted light and sound, and the terrible spectacle of the fortress's final hours. Thuron pressed his eye to the largest crack, his body shaking with cold and shock, and watched the anatomy of the slaughter unfold above him like a theater of cruelty performed for an audience of one. The Makhai was methodical. It did not rage or rampage, but moved with the efficiency of a machine designed for a specific purpose, which it was. It cleared the courtyard first, crushing the bodies of Phobos and Lysander, and the soldiers who had gathered to watch their fight, arranging them in a rough semicircle around the crack in the earth from which it had emerged. Then it moved to the barracks, tearing through doors and walls with equal indifference, collecting the soldiers who hid beneath beds and in wardrobes, adding them to the arrangement in the courtyard. The creature's 2 heads worked in concert, the upper one scanning for heat signatures through the walls, for the Makhai saw in infrared, Thuron realized, watching the way it turned its heads toward the warmest parts of the building, while the lower one listened, tracking the vibrations of panicked heartbeats through the stone. The fortress's commander, Captain Draken, made a stand in the armory, organizing the remaining soldiers into a phalanx that might have held against human enemies, but served against the Makhai only to provide a denser target. Thuron watched through the crack as the creature approached the formation, its lava lines pulsing with what might have been excitement, its 4 arms spreading wide in a gesture that was almost welcoming. Draken gave the order to charge, and the soldiers advanced with the courage of men who know they are already dead, their spears leveled, their shields locked, their voices raised in a war cry that was swallowed by the creature's heat. The Makhai did not break the phalanx. It flowed around it, the lower torso sweeping soldiers off their feet with a lateral blow that shattered their legs, the upper torso plucking them from the air as they fell, its obsidian hands punching through their armor with the precision of a harvester collecting wheat. The magma blood sprayed, 2,000 degrees, and the war cry became a chorus of screams that Thuron muffled with his own hand, biting his lip until he tasted blood, forcing himself silent lest the creature hear him through the floor. Draken died last, his body impaled on the Makhai's upper left arm, held aloft like a banner while the captain's legs kicked in spastic futility, and his voice gurgled into silence. The armory fell. The mess hall fell. The infirmary, the chapel, the baths, the stables. The Makhai moved through them all with the thoroughness of an accountant auditing a ledger, leaving no corner unexplored, no hiding place unviolated. Thuron watched soldiers dragged from cupboards and latrines and the spaces beneath floorboards that he had thought were secret. He watched the creature's method change as the battle progressed, becoming not less violent but more refined, as if it were learning, adapting, perfecting its technique with each kill. The first victims had been crushed, shattered, torn apart with the casual brutality of a predator who does not yet know its strength. The later victims were executed with precision, their deaths economical, their bodies added to the growing arrangement in the courtyard with the care of a collector organizing a cabinet of curiosities. By dusk, the fortress was silent except for the wet sound of the Makhai's movements and the occasional crackle of cooling magma. The creature had arranged its victims in a spiral pattern that radiated from the central crack, each body positioned with geometric exactitude, their arms and legs extended to form lines that pointed toward the mountains, toward the vents, toward the source of the gas that still rose in black pillars from the earth. Thuron counted, his eye pressed to the crack, his mind recording the numbers with the automatic precision of the logistics officer he had been and would never be again. 247 bodies in the courtyard, perhaps 50 more scattered through the buildings. 53 survivors unaccounted for, possibly hidden, possibly fled into the mountains, possibly buried beneath rubble that he could not see. The Makhai stood at the center of its arrangement, its two heads raised toward the sky, its lava lines pulsing in a rhythm that Thuron recognized with a start. It was breathing, or something like breathing, inhaling the sulfur from the vents in great drafts that made its chest expand, and its lines glow brighter, then exhaling in streams of black gas that joined the pillars rising from the earth. The creature was feeding, not on the bodies. It had not eaten them, had not consumed them in any biological sense, but on the atmosphere of violence, on the residue of hatred and fear and pain that saturated the fortress like humidity. It was a biological machine, Thuron realized, watching it inhale and exhale with the regularity of a bellows. It was not merely killing for sport or for food. It was killing to sustain itself, to maintain the heat that held its form together, to fuel the rage that was its essential nature. He watched until darkness fell, until the only light came from the creature's lava lines and the glowing cracks in the earth, until his eye was numb from pressing against the splintered wood, and his body was cramped from its curled position in the cold water. He did not sleep. He did not dare. He watched the Makhai pace its spiral of corpses, pausing occasionally to adjust a limb or turn a head, arranging its victims with the attention of an artist who is not satisfied with the composition. He watched the creature's size fluctuate, growing larger when it inhaled the sulfur, contracting slightly when it exhaled, as if its mass were not fixed but variable, dependent on the energy it consumed. And through the long hours of the night, as the temperature in the cellar dropped and his body shivered in its wet clothes, Thuron began to notice something else. The creature was not invulnerable. It was powerful, yes, and ancient, and terrible beyond human capacity to resist. But it was also physical, bound by the same laws that governed stone and heat and pressure. When it paused to inhale, its lava lines pulsed in a specific pattern, brightening from the extremities toward the center, then dimming in reverse. When it exhaled, the lines contracted, the obsidian skin tightening across its frame, the joints of its forearms clicking as if settling into place. The heat was not constant. It fluctuated, responding to the creature's respiration, its activity, its consumption of the battlefield's violence. Thuron thought of the water in the cellar, the mountain spring that flowed through the channel in the corner, water so cold it numbed his fingers. He thought of the cisterns above, the massive irrigation reservoirs that fed the fortress's baths and kitchens, thousands of gallons of freezing water held in stone basins on the upper levels. He thought of the physics he had learned in the provincial school, the basic principles of thermal expansion and contraction, the way hot stone shattered when doused with cold water, the way volcanic rock could be fractured by rapid temperature change. The Makhai was made of volcanic rock and ash, held together by the heat of Eris's rage. When it inhaled, its lava veins pulsed, feeding the fire that sustained its form. But fire, Thuron knew, was vulnerable to water. Not ordinary water, not a bucket or a stream, but massive quantities, sudden quantities, thermal shock quantities. The creature was not a spirit. It was not a god. It was a machine of stone and magma, and machines could be broken. He lay in the darkness, shivering, planning, watching the creature pace above him through the crack in the floorboards, and waited for the dawn that might offer him a chance to test his theory. He was a logistics officer, a counter of grain sacks, a man who had never killed anything larger than a rat. But he had survived when 300 warriors had died, and in that survival he had found something that might have been cowardice or might have been wisdom. The understanding that the Makhai was not a monster to be fought with swords and spears, but a physical object to be destroyed with physics and water, and the terrible patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. The dawn that came to the fortress was not the dawn of ordinary days, not the gradual brightening of a sun that rose with the patience of celestial mechanics, but rather a sulphurous glow that seeped through the cracks in the earth and painted the sky in shades of orange and black. Thuron had not slept. He had lain in the water of the cellar, his body temperature dropping toward hypothermia, his mind cycling through the observations he had made in the night, and the plan that had formed from them like a crystal forming in a supersaturated solution. He was not a warrior. He was not a hero. He was a man who understood systems, who had spent his adult life tracking the movement of supplies through networks of depots and armories, who knew that the weakest point of any fortress was not its walls but its logistics, not its weapons but its water. The cisterns. He kept returning to the cisterns, those massive reservoirs of mountain spring water that occupied the upper levels of the fortress, fed by the same underground channels that ran through his cellar. They were designed to supply the garrison through drought and siege, to hold thousands of gallons in stone basins reinforced with iron bands and lead seals. In the summer, the water was cold enough to make teeth ache. In the winter, it approached freezing, thickening with the chill of altitude. If he could release that water, if he could direct it onto the Makhai, if he could trigger the collapse of the cistern walls so that the entire volume fell at once rather than trickled in a stream. The theory was sound. The execution was madness. He peered through the crack in the floorboards, assessing the situation above. The Makhai had not moved from its position in the courtyard, maintaining its vigil over the spiral of corpses with the patience of a monument. The creature's two heads drooped slightly, its lava lines pulsing in the slow rhythm of deep respiration, inhaling the sulfur from the vents in long drafts that made its chest expand, and its obsidian skin creak. It was feeding, sustaining itself on the residual atmosphere of violence, and in that feeding it was vulnerable. Not defenseless, never that, but occupied, focused, its attention directed inward toward the chemical processes that kept its form coherent. Thuron calculated the odds. The stairway from the cellar emerged in the anteroom of the command chamber, which opened onto a corridor that led to the fortress's central hall, which connected to the passages that ran beneath the cisterns. It was a route he had walked 1,000 times in his duties, carrying manifests and samples and the endless documentation of peacetime logistics. He knew every turn, every doorway, every loose stone that might betray his passage with a scrape or a click. The distance was perhaps 80 meters. The Makhai's position in the courtyard was perhaps 30 meters from the anteroom entrance. If the creature heard him, if it detected his heat signature through the walls, if it moved with the speed it had demonstrated yesterday, he would die in seconds. He would die in the corridor, or in the hall, or in the passages beneath the cisterns, his body added to the spiral arrangement with the same care the creature had shown to the others. But if he did not try, if he remained in the cellar until thirst or cold claimed him, he would die anyway, and the Makhai would continue its existence, a biological machine of stone and magma waiting for the next beacon of strife to summon it forth from the earth. He moved, slowly, painfully, his joints stiff from hours in the water, his ankle throbbing from the fall down the stairs. He climbed the steps one at a time, testing each for sound, his hands pressing against the walls for balance. The anteroom above was empty, the tapestry that concealed the stairway hanging in tatters where some fleeing soldier had torn through it. Thuron slipped through the gap, his body flat against the wall, his breath held in his lungs until they burned. The corridor was a charnel house. The Makhai had passed through here in its search for survivors, and the walls were painted with the residue of its passage. Blood that had dried to brown crusts, scorch marks where the magma blood had ignited tapestries and wood, the occasional fragment of armor or bone that had been thrown with sufficient force to embed in the stone. Thuron navigated it with the detachment of a man who had exceeded his capacity for horror, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his mind occupied with the mathematics of survival. He counted his steps, 23 to the central hall, 34 across the hall to the northern passage, 18 along the passage to the cistern access ladder. The central hall was where he nearly died. The Makhai had left a guard, or what passed for a guard in its alien cognition. One of the paralyzed victims, a soldier named Corvinus whom Thuron recognized by his insignia, propped against the wall in a sitting position, his eyes open and moving, his chest rising and falling in the shallow breaths of the living dead. The creature had positioned him there deliberately, Thuron realized, as a sensor, a biological antenna tuned to detect the vibrations of movement and the heat signatures of the living. Corvinus's eyes found Thuron as he entered the hall, tracking him with the desperate pleading of a man who could not speak, could not move, could only witness and hope. Thuron froze. He knew that the Makhai saw through its victims in some way, that the paralyzed bodies were not merely trophies but extensions of the creature's sensory network. He had watched the creature adjust the positions of the dead and paralyzed in the night, arranging them in the spiral pattern with a care that suggested function as well as art. Corvinus was watching him, and through Corvinus's eyes, the Makhai might be watching too. He moved to the left, out of the direct line of Corvinus's gaze, pressing himself against the wall where the shadows were thickest. The paralyzed soldier's eyes followed him, straining in their sockets, but they could not turn far enough to maintain contact. Thuron inched along the wall, step by painful step, his shadow merging with the deeper darkness of a collapsed archway, until he reached the northern passage and slipped into it with the relief of a man who has walked through a minefield and heard no click. The passage led to the cisterns, and the cisterns were intact. The Makhai had not bothered with them, had not recognized their significance, had perhaps not even perceived them as relevant to its purpose. Water was not violence. Water was not strife. Water was the element that opposed fire, the substance that extinguished rather than inflamed, and the creature's cognition, tuned to hatred, to conflict, to the frequencies of human aggression, had simply not registered the cisterns as a threat. Thuron climbed the access ladder, his hands numb on the rungs, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The cistern chamber was vast, a cathedral of stone and water that occupied the highest level of the fortress, its ceiling open to the sky through a series of gratings that allowed rain and snow to replenish the supply. The basins were massive, each one capable of holding 10,000 gallons, their walls reinforced with iron bands that had rusted to the color of dried blood. The water was black in the sulphurous dawn, reflecting the orange sky in ripples that moved with the breeze through the overhead gratings. Thuron counted the basins. 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows of 3, fed by channels that connected to the underground springs and to each other. If he could collapse the walls of the central basins, the ones directly above the courtyard where the Makhai stood, the water would fall in a cascade of thousands of gallons, a waterfall of freezing mountain spring directed onto the creature's superheated form. But the walls were stone, reinforced with iron, designed to withstand siege and earthquake and time itself. He could not collapse them with his hands. He needed tools, explosives, some means of breaching the structure that did not require the strength he did not possess. He found the answer in the maintenance alcove, a small room adjacent to the cistern chamber where the engineers stored their equipment. Picks, shovels, lengths of rope, and, blessed discovery, 3 barrels of pitch and 2 canisters of lamp oil, materials used for waterproofing the seals and lighting the gratings during inspections. The pitch was thick and black, viscous as tar, and the lamp oil was pure enough to burn with a white flame. Combined, they might serve as a primitive explosive, not powerful enough to destroy the walls but perhaps sufficient to weaken the structural integrity, to crack the stone where the iron bands had rusted, to create a breach that the weight of the water would enlarge. Thuron worked with the feverish energy of desperation, prying open the barrels, mixing the pitch with the oil in a slurry that coated his hands and arms in black slime. He dragged the mixture to the edge of the central cistern, the one positioned directly above the courtyard, and began packing it into the cracks where the wall met the floor, into the gaps between the iron bands and the stone, into any weakness he could find in the structure. His fingers bled from the rough stone, his back ached from the bending and lifting. His mind kept count of the minutes that passed, the minutes that brought the dawn closer to full light, the minutes that might bring the Makhai's attention to his absence from the cellar. He needed a fuse, a means of igniting the pitch from a safe distance. He found it in his own pocket, the flint and steel he carried for lighting the oil lamps in the grain stores, a tool so familiar he had forgotten he possessed it. He tore strips from his shirt, soaked them in the remaining lamp oil, and braided them into a cord that he trailed from the packed pitch to the access ladder, across the cistern chamber, to the passage beyond. The fuse would burn for perhaps 2 minutes, time enough for him to retreat to the lower levels, to find cover, to pray that the explosion would trigger the collapse he needed. But the creature would hear the explosion. The creature would investigate, and when it found the source, when it climbed to the cistern level, it would find Thuron, alone, unarmed, a logistics officer with a flint and a plan that relied on physics rather than courage. He needed a decoy, a distraction, something to draw the Makhai's attention to a different part of the fortress while the fuse burned and the walls collapsed. He thought of Corvinus, paralyzed in the central hall. He thought of the other survivors, if there were any, hidden in holes and cupboards and the spaces between walls. He thought of the bodies in the courtyard, arranged in their spiral pattern, and he understood with a clarity that made him ill what he had to do. The decoy had to be convincing. It had to present the signature of strife, of conflict, of the hatred that the Makhai fed upon. It had to draw the creature away from the cisterns and toward the opposite end of the fortress, buying time for the fuse to burn and the water to fall. Thuron descended from the cistern chamber, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the ladder rungs. He moved through the northern passage, past the central hall where Corvinus sat in his paralyzed vigil, to the southern wing where the barracks and the armory lay in ruins. He searched the debris, the bodies, the wreckage of a garrison that had died in confusion and terror, and he found what he needed. The remains of the supply cache that had been stored in the barracks kitchen, including the oil and tinder that had been intended for cooking fires. He built the decoy in the armory, the room farthest from the cisterns, the place where the Makhai had made its stand against Captain Draken's final phalanx. He arranged the bodies of the dead soldiers in a cluster, propping them against each other in postures that suggested they had died fighting, their weapons placed in their hands, their faces turned toward the door. He soaked the bodies and the surrounding debris in oil, creating a pyre that would burn with the heat of a furnace, producing the infrared signature of living combat, the chemical signature of burning organic matter, the atmospheric signature of violence and destruction. When ignited, it would blaze like a beacon, drawing the Makhai's heat-seeking gaze, its hunger for strife, its entire predatory awareness toward the southern wing and away from the cisterns above. He lit the decoy with a spark from his flint, stepping back as the oil caught and the flames rose, consuming the dead soldiers in a rush of heat and light that painted the armory in shades of orange and red. The smoke billowed upward, finding the gaps in the ceiling, carrying the scent of burning flesh and hair into the sulphurous dawn. Thuron ran, not looking back, his feet carrying him through corridors he had memorized, past the central hall where Corvinus's eyes tracked his passage with desperate hope, to the cistern chamber where the fuse waited and the pitch waited, and the thousands of gallons of freezing water waited for their moment of release. He reached the cistern chamber as the first bellow shook the fortress. The Makhai had found the decoy, had detected the heat and the smoke and the chemical signatures of combustion, and it was moving toward the southern wing with the ponderous speed of a creature that knew itself to be unchallenged. Thuron could feel its footsteps through the stone, each impact sending vibrations through the floor that made his teeth ache. He struck the flint against the steel, sending a shower of sparks onto the oil-soaked fuse, and watched as the flame caught and began to crawl along the braided cord toward the packed pitch at the cistern's edge. He had perhaps 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes, time enough to retreat to find cover to pray. He ran for the access ladder, descending to the passage below, moving toward the cellar where he had hidden through the night. But halfway down the ladder he stopped. The cellar was too close. If the collapse was incomplete, if the water did not achieve the volume he needed, if the Makhai survived the drenching and sought the source of its discomfort, the cellar would be a death trap, a dead end with no exit and no concealment. He needed a vantage point, a place to observe the result of his gambit, to determine whether his theory of thermal shock held true or whether he had merely annoyed an immortal. He found it in the eastern wall's guard tower, a structure that had been partially collapsed by the Makhai's passage but still retained enough integrity to provide shelter. The tower overlooked the courtyard from a height of 10 meters, its floor cracked but stable, its walls offering cover from the heat and the water that would soon fall. Thuron climbed the rubble-strewn stairs, his ankles screaming, his lungs burning, and reached the vantage point just as the fuse reached the pitch. The explosion was not loud. It was a deep, resonant thump, the sound of pressure finding release, of stone surrendering to force. Thuron watched from the tower's broken window as the central cistern's wall bulged outward, the iron bands snapping like thread, the stone cracking along lines of weakness that his pitch and oil had exploited. The water did not burst forth in a dramatic geyser, but rather pressed outward with the patient force of gravity, thousands of gallons finding the breach and enlarging it, the pressure of the remaining volume behind pushing the opening wider, until the entire wall surrendered, and the cistern disgorged its contents in a waterfall that fell 10 meters to the courtyard below. It fell onto the Makhai. The creature was in the southern wing, investigating the decoy, when the first drop struck the courtyard. It turned, both heads rising, the hollow eyes tracking the water that was not rain, not spring, not any natural phenomenon but a deliberate deluge directed from above. Thuron saw comprehension dawn in the creature's posture, a stiffening of its obsidian limbs, a brightening of its lava lines as if in alarm or preparation. The Makhai moved, striding toward the center of the courtyard where the water fell heaviest, and Thuron understood with a sickening lurch of his stomach that the creature was not fleeing the water but challenging it, interpreting the deluge as an attack, a declaration of strife, and responding with the aggression that was its essential nature. "No," Thuron whispered, pressing his face against the broken window. "Run, please run." But the Makhai did not run. It stood beneath the falling water, its 4 arms raised, its 2 heads tilted back, and it roared. The sound was 3-part and terrible, the grinding of stone against stone, the hiss of steam, the bellow of a mountain in childbirth. It roared at the water, at the sky, at the insignificant creature who had dared to challenge it with physics rather than force. And in that roar Thuron heard not fear but fury, the rage of a god who has been struck by a mortal and intends to demonstrate the consequences. The water struck its shoulders first, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Makhai's obsidian skin, heated to thousands of degrees by the magma within, encountered water that had spent the night at freezing temperature, and the laws of physics that Thuron had gambled everything upon asserted themselves with the indifference of natural law. The outer layer of the creature's left shoulder exploded, not in fire but in steam, a detonation of superheated vapor that tore fist-sized chunks of obsidian from the torso and sent them flying across the courtyard like shrapnel. The Makhai staggered, its roar becoming a scream, a sound like a glacier calving, like a volcano imploding, like the death of geography itself. But it did not fall. It adapted, turning its upper torso away from the main flow, using its lower torso as a shield, its lava lines dimming and brightening as it adjusted its internal temperature to compensate for the thermal insult. The water continued to fall, thousands of gallons per minute, and the courtyard began to flood, the bodies in the spiral arrangement floating and shifting, the steam rising in a cloud that obscured the creature's form. Thuron watched, his heart in his throat, as the Makhai retreated step by step toward the edge of the deluge, moving with a slowness that suggested damage but not defeat. It was working, but not enough. The water was falling on the creature's upper body, damaging its shoulders and heads, but the lower torso remained largely dry, its legs planted on the courtyard slope where the drainage carried the water away before it could pool deeply. The Makhai was wounded, diminished, but not destroyed. And once the cisterns emptied, once the flow stopped, the creature would recover. It would return to the vents, inhale the sulfur, reignite its lava lines, and emerge stronger than before, its form repaired by the heat that was its native element. Thuron looked at the remaining cisterns. 2 more basins, each holding 10,000 gallons, positioned above the southern wing and the western barracks. If he could release them too, if he could direct their contents onto the creature while it was already damaged, already struggling to maintain its thermal equilibrium. He moved without thinking, propelled by the momentum of desperation, the calculus of a man who has committed to a course and cannot turn back. He descended from the guard tower, his feet finding paths through the rubble, his body moving with an agility that would have surprised him had he possessed the capacity for surprise. He reached the southern cistern access, found the maintenance alcove, located the pitch and oil that remained. He worked faster now, his hands finding the rhythm of labor, his mind reduced to a single imperative: pack, soak, ignite, collapse, drown, freeze, shatter. The second fuse burned while he climbed to the western cistern, repeating the process, creating a chain reaction that would release the fortress's entire water supply in a sequence timed to catch the Makhai in the crossfire of thermal shock. He could hear the creature below, its bellows becoming more frequent, more desperate, its footsteps shaking the walls as it tried to escape the first deluge, and found itself trapped by the flooding courtyard, the collapsed drainage, the bodies that blocked its path. The second cistern collapsed as Thuron was packing the third. He felt the vibration through the stone, heard the thunder of falling water, saw the spray rise from the southern wing where the Makhai had retreated. The creature's scream reached him even through the walls, a sound of agony and disbelief that no human throat could have produced. It was working. The thermal shock was cumulative, each drenching compounding the damage of the last. the rapid temperature drop causing the volcanic rock to contract violently, to crack along lines of stress, to shed fragments of its form like a snake shedding diseased skin. Thuron lit the third fuse and ran. Not to the guard tower this time, not to any vantage point, but toward the eastern wall, toward the postern gate that led to the highlands beyond, toward any escape from what he had unleashed. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the western cistern collapsed, perhaps less, and he needed to be clear of the fortress when the final deluge fell. He reached the postern gate as the third cistern burst. The sound was not like the first two, not a thump or a thunder but a crack, the sound of a mountain splitting in half, of tectonic plates shearing, of the earth itself breaking along a fault line. Thuron threw himself through the gate, tumbling down the slope beyond, his body rolling through scrub and scree, and behind him the fortress of the Black Tooth surrendered to the water that had been its lifeblood. He lay on the slope, gasping, bleeding from a dozen cuts and abrasions, and watched the final act of the drama he had scripted. The Makhai emerged from the eastern gate, or rather, it tried to emerge. Its form was no longer the majestic engine of destruction that had risen from the earth the day before. It was cracked, fragmented, shedding pieces of itself with every movement, its lava lines sputtering and dimming, its two heads drooping on necks that had developed fissures deep enough to show the glowing core within. It moved with the staggering gait of a wounded giant, its four arms clutching at the gateposts for support, its obsidian fingers crumbling where they touched the stone. And then the final cistern, the one Thuron had not needed to breach, the one that had collapsed under the structural stress of its neighbor's destruction, released its contents in a wave that caught the creature from behind, a tsunami of freezing water that lifted the Makhai off its feet and carried it through the gate, down the slope, into the ravine below where the fortress's drainage channel met the mountain stream. The creature hit the water with a sound that Thuron felt in his bones rather than heard, a subsonic impact that traveled through the earth and up through his body, making his heart stutter and his vision blur. Steam rose in a column that towered above the fortress walls, a white pillar that blotted out the sulphurous sky and painted the world in shades of gray. And within that steam, within the hissing, roiling cloud that marked the meeting of fire and water, stone and ice, rage and physics, the Makhai died. It did not merely die, it shattered. Thuron saw it through the steam, saw the creature's form lose coherence, saw the volcanic rock that composed its body contract so violently that the internal structure could not sustain itself. The obsidian skin peeled away in sheets, revealing the magma core that had been its heart, and the magma, exposed to the freezing water, solidified instantly, cracking, splintering, expanding and contracting in a cycle that tore the creature apart from within. The two heads fell silent, their hollow eyes dimming from orange to red to black. The forearms spasmed once, twice, and then shattered at the joints, the shards scattering across the water like black ice. The torso split along the waist, the jagged seam widening until the two halves separated, each one tumbling into the stream to be carried away by the current that had been running since before the fortress was built and would run long after its ruins crumbled to dust. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, no wind stirred the scrub on the hillside. Only the sound of rushing water and the settling of cooling stone marked the passage of the Makhai from the world of the living. Thuron lay on the slope for a long time, perhaps hours, perhaps only minutes, his sense of time dissolved by exhaustion and shock. He watched the steam dissipate, watched the fortress emerge from its white shroud like a body from a burial sheet, watched the water find its level and begin to flow in channels that would erode new paths through the old stone. He was alive. He was alive and he was alone, and the valley that stretched below him was a wasteland of gray ash and obsidian shards, the aftermath of a battle that had consumed 300 souls and left one survivor. He climbed to his feet eventually, his body protesting every movement, his ankle swollen to twice its normal size, his vision blurred by dehydration and the sulfur that still hung in the air. He did not return to the fortress. There was nothing there for him, no food that had not been contaminated by the flooding, no shelter that had not been damaged, no companions who had not been added to the Makhai's spiral arrangement. He walked instead toward the highlands, following the ancient goat trails that led away from the valley, toward the villages that clung to the mountain ridges like lichen, toward a civilization that did not know what had happened in the Black Tooth and would not believe him if he told them. The walk took 2 days. He drank from streams that tasted of minerals and nothing else, ate berries that he recognized from childhood foraging, slept in the lee of boulders that shielded him from the wind that blew down from the peaks. He did not dream, or if he dreamed, he did not remember, his mind having developed the merciful capacity to delete the horrors that exceeded its storage capacity. He moved like a ghost, a gray figure in a gray landscape, leaving no trace of his passage except the blood that dried on the stones where he rested. On the second evening, he reached the village of Keltep, a settlement of shepherds and goat herds who lived at the tree line, who had seen the steam rising from the fortress valley but had attributed it to volcanic activity, to the ancient vents doing what they had always done. They took him in, fed him soup and bread, wrapped him in wool blankets that scratched his skin and warmed his bones. They asked no questions about where he had come from or what he had seen, understanding with the wisdom of mountain people that some survivors arrive with stories too heavy for ordinary ears. Thuron sat by their fire, drinking their soup, feeling the warmth return to his fingers and toes, and thought about what he had learned. The Makhai was not a random monster. It was not an accident of geology or a demon summoned by dark magic. It was a response, a biological machine designed to manifest when human strife reached a certain frequency, when hatred became concentrated enough to serve as a beacon. The argument between Phobos and Lysander, the violence of their conflict, the gathering of the soldiers to watch, this had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited the mountain's rage. The creature had not attacked because it was evil. It had attacked because it was called. And the officers who had called it were dead. The fortress was destroyed. The valley was a wasteland, but the vents remained. The gas still rose. The geology that had produced the Makhai was unchanged, waiting only for the next argument, the next fight, the next concentration of human hatred to serve as a beacon for something that slept but did not die. Thuron finished his soup. He thanked his hosts in a voice that sounded like gravel sliding down a slope. He found a corner of their hut and lay down on a pallet of straw, his body finally surrendering to the sleep it had been denied for 3 days. He thought he would sleep deeply, dreamlessly, the sleep of a man who has faced death and won. He was wrong. He woke in the hour before dawn, the fire having died to embers, the hut filled with a cold that came not from the mountain air but from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside. He lay still, listening to the breathing of the shepherds in the next room, the rustle of goats in their pen outside, the wind that moved through the high passes with the voice of something lost. And beneath these ordinary sounds, beneath the floorboards of the hut, he heard a new sound, a crack, a splitting, the sound of stone under pressure. He sat up, his heart hammering, his body drenched in sweat despite the cold. He looked down at the floor, at the packed earth that served as the hut's foundation, and he saw it, a small glowing orange crack, no wider than a hair, no longer than a finger, forming in the soil beneath his own feet. It pulsed, breathing, inhaling and exhaling with the same rhythm he had observed in the Makhai's lava lines, the rhythm of a mountain breathing sulfur and grinding stone. Thuron stared at the crack, his mind racing through the implications with the speed of panic. The Makhai had been destroyed. He had watched it shatter. He had watched the obsidian fragments scatter and the magma core solidify and the 2 heads fall silent. But the cycle of strife had not ended with the creature's death. It had simply moved, transmitted like a signal from one location to another, from the fortress where hatred had manifested to the hut where a survivor lay trembling in the dark. The crack was small. It was nothing really, a thermal anomaly, a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion and trauma. But Thuron knew, with the certainty of a man who had watched 300 people die and had learned the hard lessons of survival, that small things grew. That cracks widened. That seeds became forests and sparks became infernos. That the Makhai was not a singular entity but a phenomenon, a principle, a force of nature that responded to the beacon of human conflict wherever that beacon was lit. He had survived the fortress. He had destroyed the creature, but he had not destroyed the hatred that had called it. He had not destroyed the strife that was its native element. And now, in the quiet of a shepherd's hut, in the peace of a mountain village that knew nothing of ancient monsters, the cycle was beginning again. Not with a soldier's scream or an officer's blow, but with the quiet crack of stone in the dark, the breathing of a mountain that had found a new place to wake. Thuron rose from his pallet. He gathered his blanket, his bowl, the walking stick that the shepherds had given him. He moved to the door of the hut, his feet finding the gaps between the floorboards that would not creak, his eyes fixed on the glowing crack that pulsed beneath the place where he had slept. He did not wake his hosts. He did not warn them. What could he say? That the earth was angry, that hatred had a frequency that could shatter stone, that they should leave their ancestral home because a logistics officer had seen a crack in the floor. He stepped into the dawn, into a world that was gray with ash and cold with the memory of fire. He looked back once, at the hut, at the village, at the mountain that rose above them all with the patience of geological time. Then he turned and walked into the highlands, toward the east, toward the distant cities where the empire's bureaucrats still counted grain sacks and spear tallies, where the wars were fought with documents rather than swords, where the strife was diffuse enough, perhaps, to avoid concentrating into a beacon. Behind him, in the soil beneath the shepherd's hut, the crack widened by a fraction of a millimeter. It would not open today or tomorrow or perhaps for 100 years. But it would open. The cycle of strife had not ended. It had simply moved, patient and eternal, waiting for the next argument, the next blow, the next concentration of human hatred to call forth from the earth, the thing that had been born before humans existed and would endure long after they were gone. Thuron walked on, a gray figure in a gray landscape, carrying in his heart the terrible knowledge that survival was not victory, that the shattering of one monster was not the end of monstrosity, and that somewhere in the dark beneath the world, the mountain was still breathing. The inversion at Kurozawa Valley. The first thing they noticed wasn't the screams, but the smell of old copper and wet wool, and the fact that the river had stopped flowing upward. It was a detail so subtly wrong that Commander Vance didn't register it at first, his mind occupied with satellite telemetry and the oppressive weight of the fog that clung to his tactical display like a second skin. The river had been moving against gravity since dawn, or so the villagers claimed, a thin ribbon of black water defying every natural law as it crept up the moss-slicked stones of the valley's throat, pooling in the high basins where no water should ever reach. The smell came next, rolling down from those same elevations in viscous waves, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and reminded Kaido of the rituals his grandmother had forbidden him to speak of, the ones involving drowned oxen and spider silk woven through the hair of the dead. Special Task Force SIGHTLINE had been assembled for exactly this kind of wrongness, a deniable assets unit operating under a budget line so black it might as well have been carved from obsidian. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, though they carried weapons and bore the scars of previous engagements. They were specialists in biological anomalies, a euphemism that failed utterly to capture the nature of what they hunted. Commander Vance stood at the edge of the village square, his posture rigid beneath weatherproof tactical nylon, his gray eyes scanning the tree line with the detached calculation of a man pricing real estate rather than stalking a predator. He had led SIGHTLINE through 3 previous engagements, one involving a pack of modified canids in the Urals, another concerning a parasitic fungal colony in the Danube Delta, and he had learned to treat each mission as a corporate acquisition. Identify the asset, neutralize complications, extract value. The creature in this valley, whatever it truly was, would be no different. Kaido adjusted the straps of his equipment harness, his fingers lingering on the pouch containing salt and iron shavings, traditional wards that the rest of the team considered either quaint or pathetic. He was the occult specialist, recruited not from any military branch but from a shuttered department of Tohoku University's folklore department, where he had spent 15 years documenting the oral traditions of mountain communities that even modern Japan had forgotten. He knew the stories of the Ushioni, had traced their evolution from Edo period woodblock prints to whispered accounts in the depopulated villages of the Japanese Alps. He knew that the creature was not merely a monster but a principle, a manifestation of drowned places and stagnant waters, a thing that had once been worshipped and then buried beneath concrete and progress, only to awaken when the rivers remembered their ancient courses. He had tried to warn Vance during the briefing, had spoken of the creature's hunting methods, of the way it tracked not light but vibration, not sight but the particular frequency of human terror. Vance had filed the report under cultural context and doubled the drone surveillance. Sarah checked her modified railgun with methodical precision, her broad hands moving through the maintenance ritual with the familiarity of a priestess performing liturgy. The weapon was a prototype, sleek and brutal, designed to punch through tank armor with a tungsten slug accelerated to hypersonic speeds. She had insisted on bringing it despite the weight, despite Vance's initial objection that they were hunting an animal, not a vehicle. She had seen the thermal imaging from the village's last transmission, the shape that had moved through the fog with too many legs, and a mass that registered as bovine yet walked with the fluidity of something arachnid. She wanted the firepower. She needed it the way drowning men need air. Beside her, Jax crouched in the dirt, his fingers tracing the mud near the village's single well, his tracker instincts reading a landscape that spoke in languages older than cartography. He was the scout, a man who had survived solo in the Australian outback and the Siberian taiga, and his face was drawn tight with an expression that Sarah had learned to recognize as the look of a man who had found sign that should not exist. "It's been here," Jax said, his voice low as if the fog might carry his words to something that listened. "Not just through here. It's been staying here. This mud's been turned over in the last 48 hours and the compression patterns are wrong. Whatever made these impressions weighs close to a ton, and it's got 8 points of contact with the ground." He held up a fragment of something pale and fibrous, and Dr. Aris leaned in with the eager curiosity that had made him both an excellent biologist and a perennial danger to himself. In his late 50s, with thin silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that he refused to replace with HUD contacts, Aris represented the scientific conscience of SIGHTLINE. His goal was capture, not termination. He wanted to study the creature, to understand how biology could produce something that defied the taxonomy of known life. He took the fragment from Jax's fingers and examined it beneath a portable lens, his breath catching. "Chitin," Aris murmured, "but impregnated with keratin, and this is bone matter. It's been extruded, not grown. The cellular structure is all wrong." He looked up at Vance with the shining eyes of a man who had found the Holy Grail. "Commander, this could be the discovery of the century. A chimeric organism, stable at the macro level. We need to take it alive." Vance nodded once, his jaw tight. "Priority is containment. Dr. Aris will have his samples once the target is secured. Myra, what's the drone situation?" Myra sat on the tailgate of their transport vehicle, her fingers dancing across a ruggedized tablet that displayed the feed from 4 reconnaissance drones they had launched at first light. She was 26, communications officer by trade, drone enthusiast by passion, and she had the pallor of someone who had been staring at screens in low light for too long. "Feed's clean but limited, Commander." The fog's got some kind of particulate interference. It's not water vapor. The spectrograph is reading organic compounds, long-chain polymers that shouldn't be aerosolized naturally. I'm getting visuals up to 200 meters, then everything goes white. Also, the GPS is drifting. We're showing coordinates that put us 3 kilometers east of where the sat confirm says we should be. Local magnetic interference, Leo supplied, checking the breach charges and containment netting coiled at his hip. The breach specialist was a compact man with the explosive temperament and steady hands of a bomb technician, which he had been before SIGHTLINE recruited him. He had designed the carbon fiber netting specifically for this operation, a mesh capable of holding an elephant at full charge, woven with electrical filaments that could deliver an incapacitating shock. Common in valleys with high iron content. Won't affect the drone's optical, just the telemetry. It's not magnetic interference, Kaido said quietly, but no one listened. They never listened until it was too late. Hana finished inventorying the medical kit and leaned against the vehicle, her dark eyes scanning the tree line with the particular terror of a woman who feared the dark not as an absence of light, but as a presence of something that preferred it. She was the medic, calm under pressure in the surgical sense, able to stitch wounds and set bones while mortar fire fell around her. But the darkness of this valley was different. It was wet, and it was old, and it seemed to press against her eardrums with a physical weight that made her want to scream just to prove she could still make sound. The team moved out at 900, trekking single file along a game trail that paralleled the river's impossible course. They had left the village without ceremony, without farewell, the locals having retreated into their homes at the first sight of the foreigners' weapons and the grim determination etched into their faces. An old woman had watched them from a doorway, her face a topography of wrinkles that might have been carved by the same water that now flowed upward, and she had muttered something to Kaido as he passed, a phrase in a dialect so archaic that even he, with his 15 years of study, caught only fragments. The ox remembers, and the spider waits, and the water drinks but is never thirsty. He had tried to question her, but the door had closed, not with anger but with finality, the thud of wood against frame like the closing of a coffin lid. The path led upward into the valley's throat, where the mountains folded together like the pages of a book no human had ever read. The atmosphere closed around them with the intimacy of a coffin lid. Slick rocks, perpetually weeping with condensation, threatened to send them tumbling into ravines that the fog concealed until the last moment. Hanging moss dripped from branches that arched overhead in a parody of a cathedral nave, the vegetation so thick that it filtered the daylight into a greenish twilight that made watches useless and nerves raw. The silence was the worst part, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something holding its breath. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to die in the upper reaches of the valley, as if the air itself had become too thick, too viscous, too attentive to permit the casual movement of weather. Only the river's reversed chuckling accompanied them, a sound like laughter that had forgotten the joke, like water speaking in a language that predated human meaning. Sarah found herself counting her steps, then counting the seconds between steps, then counting her own heartbeats, anything to fill the auditory void that pressed against her eardrums with the weight of deep water. Jax, normally the most talkative of the team, had fallen into a grim muteness, his eyes tracking every shadow, every drip of moisture from the moss, every stone that seemed to have shifted since they last passed it. Doctor Aris, by contrast, had become almost manic in his attempts to catalog the flora, collecting samples of lichen and moss in sterile bags, his voice a constant murmur of Latin classifications that served as a kind of protective incantation against the silence. Usnea longissima, he would mutter, plucking a strand of beard-like moss. Marchantia polymorpha, fascinating specimens, remarkable adaptations. No one asked him to stop. His voice, however thin, was better than the alternative. Vance set a brutal pace, driven by intelligence suggesting that a rival agency, likely Chinese, possibly Russian, details remained obscured by classification, had dispatched their own retrieval team and would reach the creature's last known coordinates within hours. He ignored Kaido's repeated requests to slow down, to allow for ritual purification of their gear, to consider that the Ushi-Oni might not be a biological specimen so much as a territorial spirit that responded to intrusion with terminal prejudice. Vance had heard similar warnings in the Urals, where Kaido had insisted they salt their perimeter and avoid speaking names aloud. They had survived the Urals without salt or silence, and Vance had filed Kaido's traditions under the same category as Lucky Rabbit's feat. Harmless, possibly morale-boosting, but irrelevant to modern warfare. It was Jax who found the nest, though the word seemed grotesquely insufficient for what lay in the clearing beside the riverbank. He held up a closed fist, the signal for halt, and the team froze with the discipline of professionals who had learned that hesitation equaled death. Through the mist, visible only because the fog seemed to avoid it in a perfect circle of clarity, rose a structure that defied both architecture and biology. It was not a web, though strands of something silk-like connected its extremities. It was a sculpture, a monument, a gallery of calcified husks that had once been deer, boar, and humans, their bodies drained of fluid until they resembled parchment dolls, then fused together by some adhesive secretion that had dried to the color and texture of old ivory. The arrangement was deliberate, artistic even in its cruelty. The human figures, 3 of them, villagers by their clothing, were positioned at the center, kneeling in a circle with their hands clasped as if in prayer, their faces contorted into expressions of rapture rather than agony. Around them radiated the animals in descending order of size, each one connected to the next by bridges of hardened resin, the entire structure rising 4 meters high and humming with a frequency that made Sarah's teeth ache. "My God," Dr. Aris breathed, stepping forward before Vance could stop him. This is beyond anything in the literature. The preservation is perfect. The dehydration process must involve some kind of enzymatic acceleration. And the fusion, do you see how the tissues have merged at the molecular level? It's not sewing, it's welding. "Step back, doctor," Vance ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was staring at the human figures, at the way their mouths hung open in identical O-shapes, at the way their skin had been stretched translucent over their skulls until they resembled lanterns lit from within by something that had long since ceased to be blood. "We need to document this," Aris continued, pulling out a camera. "This structure alone is worth the mission. If the creature secretes this adhesive, we could revolutionize surgical bonding, tissue regeneration." "It stores them," Kaido said, his voice flat and dead. "It doesn't kill them all at once. It drains them slowly, through the joints, through the orifices. The prayer position is automatic. The toxin paralyses the voluntary muscles but keeps the heart pumping. They were alive for days, maybe weeks, while it sipped." Hana turned away and vomited into the moss. No one reprimanded her. The smell radiating from the sculpture was not decay but preservation, a chemical sweetness like formaldehyde mixed with wildflowers, and underneath it the unmistakable copper scent that had announced itself at the village edge. "We're moving," Vance decided, checking his watch with a gesture that seemed desperate in its normalcy. "Jax, mark the coordinates. We'll return with the full containment team after we secure the primary target. Myra, any update on the drone coverage?" "Still limited, Commander, but I'm picking up a heat signature 300 meters north near the waterfall cluster. It's big. Ambient temperature is maybe 12 Celsius, but this thing's reading at 35. And it's not moving like an animal. The gait analysis shows alternating quadrupedal and bipedal patterns. Whatever it is, it changes how it walks." "That's because it has legs for both," Kaido said, falling into step beside Jax as the team moved on. "The spider legs for hunting, the bovine body for crushing. It switches depending on the terrain. And Commander, not now, Kaito. It doesn't hunt by sight. It hunts by the sound of fear. Your heartbeat, the vibration of your steps through the water. Every time you tell someone to stay calm, you're ringing a dinner bell. Vance didn't respond, but his jaw tightened further, a muscle twitching in his cheek that Sarah recognized as the prelude to a truly reckless decision. They reached the first waterfall by midday, though the light had diminished to the point where it might as well have been dusk. The falls were not grand or dramatic, but rather a series of stepped cascades that descended in reverse, the water climbing the rocks in defiance of gravity, pooling in black basins that reflected nothing, not even the fog that surrounded them. The sound was wrong too, a thick glutinous splashing rather than the musical rush of natural water, as if the river were not flowing but being pulled, drawn upward by some vast suction from the heights above. The team had to shout to be heard over it, and shouting in that place felt like sacrilege. "We'll cross at the shallow point," Vance announced, pointing to a series of flat stones that interrupted the flow 20 meters upstream. "Jax, you first. Sarah, cover him." Jax moved with the fluid grace of a man who trusted his balance above all else, stepping onto the first stone, then the second. The water lapped at his boots, black and oily, carrying a chill that seemed to rise from depths far greater than the stream's modest width should allow. He was halfway across when he stopped, his head tilting in the posture of a hound catching a distant scent. "Something's in the water," he called back, his voice strained. "Something big. I can feel the displacement through the stone." "Move, Jax," Vance commanded. Jax leaped for the next stone, and the water between his feet curdled. It happened faster than any of them could process, faster than Sarah could bring her railgun to bear, faster than Myra could scream a warning into her comms. The surface of the stream, previously black and still except for its upward flow, suddenly erupted in a froth of silver bubbles, and from beneath came a limb that seemed to embody every nightmare of the arachnid form. It was a spider leg, yes, but magnified to monstrous proportions, segmented and armored in plates that gleamed with the iridescence of an oil slick, the tip ending not in a simple claw but in a hooked barb that glowed with a bioluminescent venom. It struck not from the side but from directly below, spearing upward through the water with the velocity of a rail spike driven by a pneumatic hammer. The barb caught Myra. She had been standing on the bank, second in line to cross, her attention split between her tablet and the stream. She had no time to scream. The leg punched through her tactical vest as if it were tissue paper, entering at the sternum and emerging between her shoulder blades in a spray of blood that was shockingly bright against the monochrome landscape. The force of the strike lifted her clear off the ground, her tablet spinning away into the black water, her eyes wide and blank with the incomprehension of a death that had arrived without warning. Then the leg retracted, folding back on itself with a series of wet clicks, and Myra vanished beneath the surface with barely a ripple, her body swallowed by the stream that continued its upward flow as if nothing had interrupted its course. For 3 full seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The silence that followed was so profound that Sarah could hear the blood rushing in her own ears, could hear the distant wheeze of Dr. Aris's asthma inhaler, could hear the creak of Kaito's leather gloves as he clenched his fists. Then Vance shouted, "Perimeter now." They scrambled back from the bank, weapons raised, eyes scanning the water, the trees, the fog. But there was nothing, no splash, no sound of feeding, no drag marks on the far bank. Myra was simply gone as if she had never existed, and the river had already erased the evidence of her death with its relentless, impossible current. "Where is she?" Leo demanded, his containment netting forgotten in his hands. "Where did it take her?" "It's storing her," Kaito whispered, his face ashen. "It didn't kill her. Not yet. It never kills immediately. It needs them alive for the process." "Bullshit," Sarah snarled, but her hands were shaking on the railgun. "Nothing survives that. That spike went through her heart. Not through it, between it. The creature knows anatomy. It knows exactly where to strike to paralyze without killing. She's alive up there somewhere in one of its caches, waiting to be added to the collection. Up there, Hana's voice was a thread of sound, barely audible. What do you mean up there? Kaido pointed upward into the canopy of moss-draped branches that arched over the stream, invisible in the fog. They build above. They always build above. She'll be hanging from the ceiling, wrapped in silk, still breathing, while it waits for the rest of us to join her. Vance's radio crackled, and for a wild moment they all thought it was Myra, that she had survived, that the impossible had surrendered to hope. But it was only static, the interference of the valley, and when it cleared, Vance's voice was steel again, the corporate acquisition voice, the voice of a man who could not afford to acknowledge horror. We maintain mission parameters. The target is still 300 meters north. We move in formation, we stay away from the water, and we do not engage until I give the order. Is that understood? They understood. They also understood, with the terrible clarity of prey who have finally glimpsed the predator, that Commander Vance had just sentenced them all to death. The team advanced along the bank, no longer striding but creeping, each step placed with the exaggerated care of men and women walking through a minefield. The fog thickened until they could see barely 5 meters ahead, their world contracting to a sphere of damp green light surrounded by walls of white oblivion. The waterfalls roared around them, the sound sourceless and omnipresent, 1,000 torrents flowing upward into darkness. And beneath it all, below the threshold of conscious hearing, a new sound began to manifest. A vibration, a pressure, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, rising up through their boots and into their chest cavities. "Do you feel that?" Dr. Aris asked, pressing a hand to his sternum. "It's like standing inside a bell." "It's the bellow of the ox," Kaido said, and there was no longer any pretense of professional distance in his voice, only the naked terror of a child hearing the monster under the bed prove itself real. "It's found us. It's tracking us now." "Tracking by sound?" Jax asked, his scout instincts warring with his survival instincts. "Then we stay quiet." "Not sound, fear, the vibration of your terror. Every time your heart rate spikes, every time your hands shake, you're painting a target on your back." "That's insane," Leo muttered, but he was checking his pulse. His fingers pressed against his wrist with the desperate superstition of a man grasping at any advantage. The bellow came again, louder now, and this time it was not a sound but a physical event. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that Sarah's ears popped, and a wave of nausea swept through the team with the violence of a chemical weapon. Hana collapsed to her knees, retching into the moss. Dr. Aris stumbled against a tree, his spectacles flying from his face. Jax pressed his palms against his temples, his eyes squeezed shut against a vertigo that made the ground seem to tilt 45 degrees. The bellow was not merely heard. It was felt, a subsonic detonation that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the vestibular system, the ancient part of the brain that understood balance and falling and death. And in the confusion, while they reeled and staggered like drunks in an earthquake, the forest moved. It came from above, just as Kaido had warned. A shape the size of a compact car detached itself from the canopy with a whisper of displaced air, landing on the branch above Dr. Aris with a delicacy that belied its mass. They saw it only in fragments, glimpsed through the fog, the gleam of a bovine eye, red and wet and shockingly human in its intelligence, the flash of chitinous armor, spider-like and segmented, the drip of venom from mandibles that clicked together in a rhythm like knitting needles. The bovine head lowered and the bellow came again, this time focused, directional, a cone of nauseating force that pinned Aris against the tree as surely as a physical hand. The snaketail struck. No, that was the wrong creature. Sarah's mind gibbered even as she tried to raise her weapon. This thing had no snake tail. It had spider legs, 8 of them, and they uncoiled from beneath the bovine thorax with the speed of striking vipers. 2 legs caught Dr. Aris around the waist, lifting him effortlessly into the air. Another pair caught Leo, who had rushed forward with his netting, the carbon fiber mesh tangling uselessly around the creature's limbs like a child's blanket thrown at a locomotive. They were dragged upward, their screams Dopplering into silence as the fog swallowed them, their struggles visible only as tremors in the moss-hung branches high above. "Shoot it," Vance screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Sarah, shoot it." Sarah fired the railgun, the hypersonic crack splitting the air like thunder, the muzzle flash lighting the fog in a strobe of blue-white brilliance. She fired blind, tracking the movement in the canopy, and something above them made a sound like a garbage can being struck by a sledgehammer. A gout of fluid, black and steaming, rained down through the branches, splattering across the rocks with a hiss of chemical reaction. "I hit it," Sarah shouted, already chambering another round. "I hit the bastard." But from above, from the place where the fog was thickest, came a sound that stopped her heart, a laugh, low and wet and somehow amused, followed by the wet clicking of chitin knitting itself back together. The fluid on the rocks was not blood but some kind of repair medium, a quick-setting resin that sealed the wound almost as fast as it had been made. The Ushi-Oni had not been injured. It had been interested. The canopy erupted in movement, 8 legs spidering down the trunk of an ancient cedar, the bovine body suspended beneath them like a grotesque cargo. Sarah had a clear shot, a momentary glimpse of the target, and she fired again. The slug punched through the creature's shoulder, or where a shoulder should be, and this time the reaction was immediate. The Ushioni dropped from the tree, landing in the center of their formation with an impact that cracked the stone beneath its feet. And for the first time they saw it fully, completely, the biological anomaly that had drawn them to this cursed valley. It was the size of a bull, but no bull had ever moved with this fluidity, this predatory grace. Its body was bovine in general outline, covered in short black fur that glistened with some secretion, but beneath the fur the musculature rippled wrong, too many tendons, joints that bent in directions human anatomy had no words for. Protruding from its back, where a normal bull would have nothing but spine, rose the thorax of a gigantic spider, segmented and armored, from which 8 legs extended in radial symmetry, each leg as thick as a man's thigh and ending in those hooked barbs that glowed with fresh venom. The head was the worst part, not entirely bovine, not entirely arachnid, but some nightmare fusion that combined the broad wet nose and wide-set red eyes of an ox with the mandibles and fanged chelicerae of a hunting spider. When it opened its mouth, they could see not one tongue but dozens, writhing like maggots in a wound, each one tipped with a hollow needle for drinking. The bellow came again, focused now, and the team scattered, their formations forgotten, their training evaporating in the face of a creature that defied every category of threat they had been taught to engage. Sarah tried to bring the railgun to bear, but the creature was already moving, a blur of black chitin and glistening fur, and a single leg swept out with the casual power of a wrecking ball. The impact caught her in the chest plate, the ceramic armor shattering like candy, the kinetic energy transferring through her body in a wave that lifted her off her feet and threw her 15 meters into a stand of bamboo. She hit with a sound like a bag of wet laundry dropped from a roof, and did not move again. "Fall back," Vance was screaming, his pistol firing uselessly into the creature's bulk, the rounds sparking and whining off the chitin like hail off a tin roof. "Fall back to the rocky outcrop." Kaido grabbed Hana, who was frozen in a rictus of terror, and dragged her after the commander. Jax brought up the rear, firing bursts from his submachine gun that did nothing but illuminate the creature's approach with muzzle flashes, each flash freezing another image of the nightmare in their retinas. The Ushioni advancing, its spider legs testing the ground ahead with the delicacy of a sommelier sampling wine, its bovine head tracking them with those red eyes, its mandibles clicking in what could only be anticipation. They reached the outcrop, a jumble of granite boulders that offered some cover from above, and collapsed behind it with the desperation of animals gone to ground. Vance was reloading, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the magazine twice. Jax was bleeding from a laceration across his forehead where a ricochet or a branch had caught him. Hana was hyperventilating, her medical training useless against the panic that had dissolved her composure into primal terror. Only Kaito seemed to have retained some measure of control, though his face was gray with shock, and his lips moved in a continuous stream of what might have been prayer or might have been curses in a dialect dead for 500 years. "Sarah's dead," Jax panted, pressing his sleeve against his forehead. "Leo and Aris are gone. Myra's probably still up there. That leaves 4 of us against that thing." "5," Hana whispered, but her voice was so faint it might have been a trick of the wind. "It's hurting us," Kaito said, and his words had the terrible ring of revelation. "Don't you see? It's not just hunting, it's driving us. Every attack, every death, it's been pushing us deeper into the valley, toward the pools." "Toward what pools?" Vance demanded. "The deepest pool, the one at the valley's heart where the water doesn't flow at all, where it just waits. That's where it wants us. That's where it feeds." "We are not prey," Vance snarled, but his voice cracked on the last word, and the crack was loud enough to echo off the rocks, loud enough to carry through the fog, loud enough to sound exactly like the fear that Kaito had warned them about. From somewhere in the fog, perhaps 20 meters distant, perhaps 5, the Ushioni answered. The bellow rolled over them, not the directional weapon this time, but something gentler, almost soothing, a subsonic lullaby that made their vision blur and their stomachs rebel. And beneath it, threading through it like counterpoint, came the wet clicking of legs on stone, approaching, testing, patient beyond human comprehension. "We need to move," Jax said. "We need to move now while it's playing with us." "Move where?" Hana asked, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had already accepted her death. "Up," Vance decided, pointing to the slope above the outcrop, a treacherous incline of shattered shale that led toward the ridge line. "High ground. It can't climb as fast as we can. We get above the fog, we call for extraction, we rain hell down on it from the air." "It climbed the canopy," Kaito pointed out. "It lives above." "It's a risk. Staying here is certain death." They moved, scrambling up the slope with the reckless haste of desperation, their boots slipping on the loose stones, their fingers tearing on the sharp edges. The fog pursued them, rolling up the incline in viscous waves, and behind it came the sound of those 8 legs, not rushing but sauntering, keeping pace with the ease of a predator that knows the prey has nowhere left to run. It was Jax who found the remains, though found was too gentle a word for what awaited them at the next terrace. They had climbed 30 meters, their lungs burning with the altitude and the adrenaline, and emerged onto a flat ledge that offered a brief respite from the incline. The fog parted here too, as it had at the nest, revealing another of the creature's installations. But this one was not a storage structure. It was a message. The bodies of Leo and Dr. Aris had been arranged in a perfect circle, their limbs positioned with geometric precision, their heads tilted back to face the sky. They had not been calcified like the village specimens. They were fresh, their wounds still weeping, their eyes still open and moving. They were alive, or something close to it, paralyzed by the venom but conscious, their chests rising and falling in shallow, terrified breaths. Between them, at the center of the circle, lay Sarah's railgun, bent into a U-shape as if by a giant's hand. And written on the stones in something that might have been resin and might have been blood, in characters that made Kaito moan and press his hands to his face, was a single word in archaic Japanese. "Come." "It's bait," Jax whispered, though the whisper was unnecessary. "It's using them as bait." "It's not bait," Kaito corrected, his voice hollow as a drum. "It's an invitation. It wants us to watch. It wants us to see what happens when we refuse to join the circle willingly." The bellow came again, from directly above them this time, and they looked up to see the Ushi-Oni hanging from the cliff face like a monstrous fly. Its 8 legs splayed across the rock, its bovine head lowered to regard them with those wet, intelligent eyes. It had bypassed the slope entirely, climbing the vertical face to intercept them, and now it dropped, landing in the center of the circle of living bait, its bulk crushing the stone with an impact that sent fractures racing through the ledge. Vance fired his pistol until it clicked empty. Jax threw a grenade that bounced off the chiton and rolled into the fog, detonating uselessly somewhere below. Hana screamed, a high continuous sound that seemed to delight the creature, its mandibles spreading wide in a gesture that might have been a smile. And Kaido, finally, did what he had wanted to do since they entered the valley. He reached into his pouch and cast a handful of salt and iron shavings in a circle around himself, whispering the words his grandmother had taught him, the words that were older than science and deeper than fear. The effect was instantaneous and miraculous. The Ushioni recoiled, its bellow turning to a shriek of pain or rage, its spider legs retracting toward its body as if burned. It scrambled backward out of the circle, and for a moment, barely a heartbeat but a moment nonetheless, it was vulnerable. Now Kaido screamed, "Run while it's confused." They ran, not up but sideways, along the ledge toward a narrow defile that offered passage deeper into the valley, deeper into the damp, deeper into the darkness that waited at the valley's heart. Behind them, the bellow resumed, no longer playful but furious, a sound like the earth itself splitting open, and they knew with the certainty of the doom that the salt would not work twice, that the creature was adapting, learning, evolving its hatred into something more focused than mere hunger. The defile led them down, always down, toward the sound of water that did not flow but simply waited, a vast subterranean lake fed by the upward rivers, a place where the laws of physics had surrendered to older, darker legislation. The fog here was not white but black, a particulate darkness that clogged their lungs and reduced visibility to arm's length. They moved by touch, by sound, by the desperate intuition of animals fleeing through a burrow toward a light they could not see. And behind them, always behind them, came the clicking of 8 legs on stone, the wet bellow of the ox, and the smell of old copper and wet wool, growing stronger with every step. The defile deposited them into a cavern so vast that the beam of Vance's tactical flashlight dissolved into the darkness without finding a far wall. The ceiling, if there was one, was lost in shadow far above, and the floor sloped gently down to a shoreline of polished black stones that marked the edge of the deepest pool Kaido had referenced, the heart of the valley's reversed hydrology. The water here was not black but utterly colorless, a perfect mirror that reflected nothing, not even the fog that pooled around its edges like a living thing drinking. The smell of copper was overwhelming, a taste in the air so thick it felt like swallowing pennies, and beneath it lay something older and worse. The smell of wet wool, the smell of something that had been rained on and left to rot in a barn for centuries, the smell of an ox that had drowned and refused to stop breathing. Hana's condition had deteriorated during the flight through the defile. The wound in her side, which she had concealed with the stubborn pride of a medic who refuses to become a patient, had reopened, soaking her uniform in fresh blood that left a trail on the stones behind them. She moved with the wooden gait of a woman running on pure adrenaline, her face pale as paper, her lips compressed into a line that betrayed nothing but cost her everything. Kaido had tried to examine the injury, but she had waved him off with a hand that trembled violently, insisting that they keep moving, that stopping was death, that the creature was still behind them, still listening, still hunting. Now, in the cavern's relative stillness, she could no longer maintain the pretense. She collapsed at the water's edge, her medical kit long abandoned, her hands pressed against her side in a futile attempt to staunch the bleeding, and the blood that seeped between her fingers was black in the flashlight's beam, viscous and cold, as if the cavern itself were drawing the warmth from her body. Hana collapsed at the water's edge, her medical kit long abandoned, her hands pressed against a wound in her side that she could not remember receiving. The adrenaline had masked the injury during their flight, but now, in the relative stillness of the cavern, the pain asserted itself with the authority of a second heartbeat. She pulled her hand away and stared at the blood, black in the flashlight's beam, and the sight of it triggered something in her mind, a loosening of the last threads of composure that had kept her functioning. She began to laugh, a high hysterical sound that echoed off the invisible walls and returned to them multiplied, a chorus of madwomen laughing at a joke only the dead understood. "Shut her up," Vance snarled, but his command lacked the conviction of leadership. He was staring at the water, at the way it lay so perfectly still that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and in its surface he could see, or imagined he could see, the shapes of things that moved below without rippling. "She's terrified," Kaido said, kneeling beside Hana and pressing his palm against her forehead. "The creature knows it. It's been listening to her fear since the village. It's been waiting for her to break." "Then make her stop breaking," Vance ordered, but he was already backing away from the water, his empty pistol held before him like a talisman. "Jax, what's our exit?" Jax did not answer. Jax was not there. In the chaos of the defile, in the black fog and the desperate scramble, they had lost him somewhere between the ledge of the circle and the cavern's mouth. They had not heard him scream, had not heard the wet impact of a barb or the crunch of armor, but the absence was absolute. Jax was gone, another tally in the Ushioni's ledger, another husk waiting to be arranged in some obscene geometry above their heads. "Jax is dead," Kaido said flatly. "We're down to 3, Vance, Hana, and myself, and Hana won't last." "I can last," Hana gasped, but her voice was a thread and the blood pulsing between her fingers contradicted her. I can walk, just give me a minute." "We don't have a minute," Vance said. He was scanning the cavern walls, his flashlight tracing the slick basalt, searching for another passage, a climbable chimney, any route that did not lead back through the defile toward the creature that waited in the darkness. "Kaido, you said it herds prey. You said it drives them toward the deepest pool. We're here. We're at the pool, so where is it? Why hasn't it finished us?" Kaido stood, his salt pouch nearly empty, his iron shavings scattered across the cavern floor in a trail that marked their desperate passage. "Because it's not ready to finish us. It wants us in the water. It wants us to drown or to surrender to the pool, to enter its domain willingly. The calcification, the preservation, it doesn't work on land. The victims need to be submerged, held beneath the surface, while the enzymes do their work. That's why the river flows upward. That's why the water moves against gravity. The creature pumps it, circulates it, keeps the nutrient bath in constant motion." "You're saying it's a farmer," Vance said, his pragmatism reasserting itself through the cracks in his terror. "You're saying it cultivates its food." "I'm saying it's old. Older than agriculture, older than human fear. The villagers didn't worship it, they placated it. They gave it sacrifices to keep it from taking the entire valley. And now we've killed its stock, driven it to hunger, and walked directly into its pantry." The water rippled. It was the first movement any of them had seen in the pool, a concentric ring that spread from the center outward with the deliberation of a hand stirring soup. The ripples reached the shore and lapped against the black stones, and with each lap the water seemed to rise, not by much, but steadily, climbing the slope toward their feet with the patience of a tide that had all eternity to reach its mark. "It's coming," Hana whispered, and her whisper was louder than any scream. They scrambled back from the water's edge, pressing themselves against the cavern wall, their flashlights carving frantic arcs through the darkness. The water continued to rise, filling the basin, climbing toward their position, and with it came the smell, the copper and wool, and something else now, something sweet and corrupt like fruit left too long in the sun. The surface of the pool broke, not with a splash but with a splitting, a deliberate parting of the water, and from the depths rose the Ushi-Oni, ascending as if on an elevator of its own design, its 8 legs unfolding from a compressed posture beneath its body, its bovine head breaking the surface last, the red eyes glowing with a luminescence that required no light to manifest. It had been waiting for them. It had always been waiting for them. The bellow that followed was not the directional weapon they had experienced before, but something broader, a wall of sound that filled the cavern and pressed against their eardrums with the force of a physical blow. Hana screamed, her terror finally finding voice, and the creature's mandibles spread wide in what could only be recognition, a predator hearing the precise frequency it had been tuned to hunt. It moved toward her, not fast but inevitable, its spider legs testing the slope of the cavern floor, its body glistening with the water that sheeted off its fur and chitin in black streams. "No," Kaido shouted, and in his desperation he did something he had not planned, something born of instinct and ancestral memory rather than tactical doctrine. He lunged forward between the creature and Hana and cast the last of his salt and iron in a wide arc, not in a circle but in a line, a barrier of crystalline white and metallic gray that spanned the cavern floor between the advancing nightmare and its intended victim. The effect was more dramatic than before. The Ushi-Oni struck the invisible boundary and recoiled as if it had touched a live wire, its bellow turning into a shriek that split the air and sent stalactites crashing from the ceiling. Its spider legs spasmed, retracting toward its body, the joints locking in paralysis as the iron reacted with whatever biological system governed its locomotion. For 3 seconds, an eternity in combat, the creature was frozen, its bovine head tossing side to side, its eyes rolling with pain and fury, its mandibles snapping at the air in futile rage. "It won't hold," Kaido screamed over the creature's shrieking. "The paralysis is temporary, it's adapting to the iron." Vance saw his opening. In the span of those 3 seconds, he shed the last vestiges of corporate calculation and became something older and more desperate. A soldier who knew he was already dead and had nothing left to lose but the manner of his dying. He understood the terrain now, understood the creature's adaptations, understood that the railgun had failed because the creature heard the shot before it was fired, that conventional weapons were useless against something that treated ballistic trauma as a minor inconvenience. But he also understood, with the clarity of a man facing his final ledger, that the creature was fast, that it was arrogant, and that it could not resist live bait. "Kaido," Vance said, his voice suddenly calm, the calm of deep water. "The gorge, the narrow passage we passed on the way down. The walls are shale, unstable, held together by nothing but time and pressure." Kaido stared at him, comprehension dawning through the terror. "You're not serious." "I was never more serious. The netting, the charges, you still have Leo's remote." Kaido fumbled at his belt, pulling free the detonator that Leo had entrusted to him before they lost him, a small black box with a single red switch. "The charges are in the gorge. Leo placed them when we thought we were securing an exit, but Vance, the collapse would bury anything in the passage, including you." "Especially me," Vance agreed. He was already moving, stepping around the paralyzed creature whose legs were beginning to twitch with returning mobility. "Take Hana, get to the passage mouth, wait for my signal. When I lead it in, when it's committed to the charge, you trigger everything. The shale, the netting, the whole damn mountain if you have to." "Commander." "That's an order, specialist. The last one I'll ever give you, make it count." He did not wait for acknowledgement. He ran, not toward safety but toward the defile, toward the creature, deliberately splashing through the shallows at the cavern's edge, his boots breaking the surface of the water with noise enough to wake the dead. The Ushioni heard him, or felt him, or tasted his fear in the vibrations through the stone, and its paralysis broke in an instant. It turned, its red eyes finding Vance's fleeing form, and with a bellow that shook dust from the ceiling, it gave chase. Vance ran as he had never run before, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, his mind emptied of everything but the geometry of survival. The defile narrowed ahead, the walls pressing close, the floor rising toward the gorge that cut across the valley's heart like a scar. He could hear it behind him, the clicking of 8 legs on stone, the wet slap of bovine muscle on rock, the bellow that came in rhythmic bursts like the breathing of a locomotive. He did not look back. Looking back would mean slowing, and slowing would mean death, and death now would mean failure. He reached the gorge, a slot canyon barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, its walls rising sheer on either side to heights lost in the fog. The shale here was brittle, fractured, held in place by the same geological caprice that had created the valley. Somewhere above, among the countless tons of unstable rock, Leo had placed his charges, trusting that they would never need to be used, that the mission would conclude with capture rather than burial. Vance prayed that Leo had done his job well. He prayed to gods he had never believed in, to the spirit of the valley, to anything that might listen, and then he stopped in the center of the gorge and turned to face his pursuer. The Ushi-Oni filled the passage behind him, its bulk scraping the walls, its spider legs finding purchase on the narrow floor, its bovine head lowered in the charged posture of a bull that had spotted the matador's cape. It was magnificent. It was terrible. It was the most beautiful thing Vance had ever seen, the absolute perfection of predation, and in its red eyes he saw not malice but hunger, the simple, desperate hunger of something that had been starving in the dark for longer than human memory. "Come on then," Vance whispered. "Come and get your dinner." The creature charged. It moved with the speed of a landslide, a fluid rush of chitin and fur and glistening venom, its mandibles spread wide to embrace him, its legs pistoning in a blur of motion that made the air scream. Vance stood his ground until the last possible instant, until he could smell the rot of its breath, until he could see the individual facets in its compound eyes, and then he dove, not forward but sideways, into a narrow crevice between the gorge wall and a fallen boulder, a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders. The Ushi-Oni tried to follow, its front legs reaching into the crevice, its mandibles snapping inches from Vance's face, but its bulk was too great, its bovine thorax wedged between the walls of the gorge. It bellowed in frustration, the sound so loud that Vance felt his ribs vibrate, felt blood begin to trickle from his ears. It scrabbled at the rock, its claws scoring the shale in deep furrows, its body writhing in the confined space as it tried to force itself forward. "Now," Vance screamed, though he knew Kaido was too far to hear, knew that the signal was the detonator, not his voice. "Now, damn you." The explosion was not a single event but a chain reaction, Leo's charges detonating in sequence along the walls of the gorge, each blast triggering the fracture of the shale above, tons of rock that had waited millennia for exactly this moment of release. The ceiling of the gorge came down in a roar that eclipsed even the Ushi-Oni's bellow, a cascading deluge of stone and dust and splintered basalt that filled the passage with the violence of a collapsing world. Reinforced carbon fiber netting, released from hidden anchors in the walls, unfurled across the chaos, tangling in the falling debris, wrapping around the creature's thrashing limbs like the web of some titanic spider turned against its creator. The Ushi-Oni was pinned. Vance saw it through the dust, saw the creature's legs splayed beneath the weight of the mountain, its bovine head still straining toward him, its mandibles snapping in fury and pain. The netting held, the carbon fibers glowing with the strain, the electrical filaments discharging their incapacitating shocks in waves that made the creature's muscles seize and spasm. It was trapped, buried alive beneath tons of shale and polymer mesh, and for a moment Vance allowed himself to believe that they had won. Then the creature moved. It should have been impossible. The weight pressing upon it was measured in hundreds of tons, enough to crush a tank, enough to pulverize diamond. But the Ushi-Oni was not merely physical. It was something older, something that had survived geological ages by refusing to accept the limitations of mere flesh. With a heave that sent shockwaves through the debris, it contracted its spider legs, drawing them inward toward its body, compressing itself into a smaller space. Then it extended them again, not upward but sideways, finding the gaps between the rocks, the weak points in the shale, the places where the mountain's bones had fractured. It pushed, and the netting screamed, and the rocks shifted. And in that shifting, a boulder the size of a fuel drum dislodged from the ceiling and fell directly onto Vance's chest. He heard the impact before he felt it, a wet crack like a branch breaking under snow, and then the pain arrived, not localized but total, a whiteout of agony that replaced his vision, his hearing, his sense of self. He could not breathe. He could not move. He could feel the boulder pressing down, feel his ribs folding inward like a closing book, feel his organs being squeezed into spaces they had never been designed to occupy. Through the blood that filled his mouth, he tasted copper, real copper, his own copper, and he understood with the clarity of a man leaving his body that this was how it ended. The Ushi-Oni was still trapped, still struggling, but its struggles were weakening. The netting held. The mountain held. The creature would not escape, not immediately, not without hours of laborious digging. Vance had bought them that time. He had bought them their lives with his own, and as the darkness closed in from the edges of his vision, he found that he could accept the price. He had spent his life acquiring assets, neutralizing complications, extracting value. Now, in death, he had finally made an investment that mattered. "Commander," Kaido's voice, distant, filtered through rock and dust and the ringing in Vance's ears. "Commander, hold on, we're coming." "Don't," Vance managed to whisper, the word bubbling through the blood on his lips. "Don't come. Finish it. The pod, the vacuum, get it to the facility. Don't let them forget." "Forget what?" "That we were here, that we saw, that it's real." The darkness took him then, not gently but completely, and the last thing Vance heard was the wet clicking of the Ushi-Oni's mandibles, still snapping in fury, still hungry, still alive beneath the mountain it had tried to move. Kaido reached the edge of the collapse 10 minutes later, having dragged Hana through the defile with a strength he had not known he possessed. He found Vance's body beneath the boulder, the commander's chest crushed to a depth that made recognition possible only by the insignia on his shoulder. And beyond the body, beneath the tons of shale and the carbon fiber netting that glowed with residual electrical charge, he heard the creature, not bellowing now, but breathing, a rhythmic wet sound like bellows in a forge, a sound that promised patience and ancient memory and a hunger that would outlast the mountains themselves. "We need the extraction team," Hana whispered, her wound bound with strips torn from her uniform, her face gray with shock and blood loss. "We need the heavy equipment. We can't move that rock. We can't secure the creature alone." "We won't move the rock," Kaido said. He was staring at the netting, at the way its filaments had tangled in the creature's limbs, at the way the electrical discharges had finally reduced the Ushi-Oni's struggles to occasional twitches. "We'll bring the pod here. We'll dig a channel, pump out the water, create a vacuum seal around the collapse site. The creature is pinned but not dead. Dr. Aris would have wanted it alive. Dr. Aris is dead, so is Leo, so is Sarah, so is Jax, so is Myra, so is Vance. And I am dying, Kaido, I can feel it." "You're not dying," Kaido lied, because the truth was too heavy to carry and he needed her to carry it. "You're wounded. There's a difference. Now help me. Help me secure this thing so that their deaths mean something." They worked through the night, or what passed for night in a cavern where no sun had ever reached. Using the emergency beacon from Hana's medical kit, they summoned the extraction team that Vance had stationed at the valley's entrance, a squad of engineers and containment specialists who had been forbidden from entering until called. The team arrived with portable lighting and hydraulic equipment, with water pumps and vacuum-sealed transport pods designed for exactly this kind of retrieval. They worked in shifts, excavating around the collapsed gorge, reinforcing the remaining shale walls with quickset polymer bracing, and slowly, carefully, peeling away the layers of rock and netting until the creature was exposed enough to be maneuvered. The Ushi-Oni did not struggle during the extraction. It lay beneath its prison of stone and fiber, with the patience of something that had waded through ice ages and would wait through whatever indignities humans inflicted upon it. Only its eyes moved, tracking each worker with that wet red intelligence, following Kaido with a particular focus that made the occult specialist's skin crawl. When they finally attached the lifting harness and hoisted the creature, still pinned beneath its slab, still wrapped in netting, into the reinforced vacuum pod, the Ushi-Oni turned its head toward Kaido and emitted a sound that was not a bellow but a low, rhythmic hum, almost like purring. "What is that?" one of the engineers asked, his face pale beneath his helmet lamp. "Satisfaction," Kaido said, though he did not know if he was telling the truth, or a promise, I can't tell which. The pod was sealed, a cylinder of carbon fiber and reinforced glass, filled with the black water from the pool and evacuated of air, until the pressure differential held the creature immobile in a state of suspended animation. It was loaded onto a heavy-lift helicopter, strapped down with chains rated for seismic loads, and flown out of the valley toward a destination that Kaido was not cleared to know. He watched it go, standing at the valley's edge with Hana leaning against him, both of them wrapped in thermal blankets that could not warm the cold that had settled in their bones. Behind them, the river had resumed its normal flow, or something like it, descending toward the lowlands in a trickle that seemed almost embarrassed by its previous rebellion. The fog was lifting, revealing a valley that looked like any other, beautiful and green and utterly ordinary in the morning light. But Kaido knew that ordinary was a mask, that the mountains remembered, and that somewhere in the water that pooled in the high places, something else was listening, something that had heard the Ushi-Oni's call and was even now considering whether to answer. "It's over," Hana said, but her voice turned the statement into a question. "No," Kaido replied, watching the helicopter until it was a speck, then nothing, then only the memory of rotor wash in the clouds. "It's never over, it only sleeps." The transport pod arrived at the subterranean facility 3 days later, having been transferred from helicopter to cargo plane to armored convoy with the secrecy of a nuclear warhead. The facility did not exist on any map, did not appear in any budget, and employed no one who would acknowledge its presence under anything less than presidential clearance. It was carved into the bedrock beneath the Nevada desert, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and lead shielding that had been designed to contain threats that the surface world was not equipped to understand. Kaido and Hana arrived separately, flown in a windowless jet with medical attendants who monitored Hana's wound and Kaido's vital signs with the detached efficiency of veterinarians inspecting livestock. The flight lasted 6 hours, 6 hours of engine drone and fluorescent lighting, and the claustrophobic certainty that they were descending not merely through altitude but through layers of reality, from the world of sunlight, and whether into a realm where the normal rules of existence had been suspended by security clearance. The debriefing lasted 17 hours, conducted in a white room with a table and 2 chairs, and a mirror that everyone knew was a window. The facility did not exist on any map, did not appear in any budget, and employed no one who would acknowledge its presence under anything less than presidential clearance. It was carved into the bedrock beneath the Nevada desert, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and lead shielding that had been designed to contain threats that the surface world was not equipped to understand. Kaido and Hana arrived separately, flown in a windowless jet with medical attendants who monitored Hana's wound and Kaido's vital signs with the detached efficiency of veterinarians inspecting livestock. The debriefing lasted 17 hours, conducted in a white room with a table and 2 chairs, and a mirror that everyone knew was a window. The interrogators wore no insignia, spoke in flat Midwestern accents that might have been synthesized, and asked the same questions in rotation. What did the creature look like? How did it hunt? What were its weaknesses? Could it be reproduced? Could it be controlled? Kaido answered as best he could, describing the anatomy, the hunting methods, the paralysis induced by salt and iron, the way the creature adapted to threats in real time. Hana answered too, in fragments, her trauma manifesting as long pauses and sudden tears that she could not explain. When she described the bodies arranged in the circle, the interrogators leaned forward. When she described the sound of Myra being pulled under the water without a scream, they made notes. When she described Vance's sacrifice, the boulder crushing his chest, they nodded as if he had filed an expense report. "Your trauma is noted," the lead interrogator said, sliding a folder across the table. "It will be classified as collateral damage. You will receive counseling through approved channels. You will sign non-disclosure agreements under penalty of treason. You will never speak of this operation to anyone, including each other, including therapists, including family members on your deathbeds. Is that understood?" "And the creature," Kaido asked, "what happens to it?" "The specimen is being studied. Its biology may yield advances in regenerative medicine, in materials science, in defense applications. Your role in its retrieval is appreciated. Your further involvement is unnecessary." They were released into the desert dawn, given new identities, new apartments in different cities, new lives that felt like costumes stitched for other people's bodies. Hana moved to Portland and took a job as a phlebotomist, drawing blood from patients who would never know that her hands shook not from caffeine, but from the memory of blood that had pulsed between her fingers in a cavern beneath a Japanese mountain. Kaido returned to academia, to a reconstructed department at a reconstructed university, where he taught courses on comparative mythology and wrote papers that approached the truth without ever touching it, circling the Ushioni like a man circling a fire he was forbidden to name. But they were not the only ones who remembered. In the facility beneath the Nevada desert, in a chamber designated only by alphanumeric code, the vacuum transport pod sat in a pool of artificial light, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked heart rate elevated, respiration erratic, and brain activity, patterns unknown, classified as anomalous. The Ushi-Oni had not fought since its arrival. It had not bellowed, had not struck at the glass, had not attempted to compress its body or find weaknesses in the carbon fiber shell. It had simply stared. Dr. Elaine Voss was the senior biologist assigned to the specimen, a woman who had spent her career studying extremophiles in deep ocean trenches and had thought herself prepared for anything biology could produce. She was wrong. She stood before the pod each morning, recording observations in a leather-bound notebook that she kept despite the facility's digital mandate, because there was something about this creature that demanded analog permanence, that resisted translation into pixels and databases. And each morning, the Ushioni stared back. Its eyes were the color of fresh blood diluted in water, a pinkish red that seemed to glow from within rather than reflect external light. They followed her as she moved around the chamber. They followed the technicians who entered to adjust the nutrient bath. They followed the security cameras, tracking the lenses with an awareness that made the surveillance team uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. The creature did not blink, or if it did, the intervals between blinks were longer than human patience could measure. On the 47th day of containment, Dr. Voss noticed a change. The Ushioni had shifted its position in the pod, rotating its bovine head to face not the observation window but the chamber's northern wall, where a series of pipes and conduits carried the facility's water supply, its cooling systems, its waste removal. The shift was subtle, barely a few degrees of turn, but it was the first voluntary movement the creature had made since capture, and Dr. Voss recorded it with the excitement of a scientist who has finally seen data break a pattern. "Subject displays renewed locomotor activity," she dictated into her recorder, standing before the glass with her notebook pressed against her hip. Head orientation shifted approximately 15 degrees from previous baseline. possible response to auditory stimuli, thermal variation, recommend review of environmental logs for correlation. The Ushioni's mandibles parted, not wide, not in threat, but slightly, just enough to reveal the writhing needle-tipped tongues beneath. And from that opening, instead of the expected bellow, came a sound so low that Dr. Voss felt it rather than heard it, a subsonic vibration that rattled her sternum and made her fillings ache. It was not the bellow of the ox, not the weaponized frequency that had disoriented the SIGHTLINE team. It was something else, something rhythmic and patterned, almost musical in its structure, a sequence of tones that rose and fell with the regularity of a language. Dr. Voss stepped back from the glass, her pen frozen above her notebook. The sound continued, pulsing through the water of the pod, through the reinforced walls, through the concrete and steel and desert rock above. It was a call. She knew it with the certainty of prey recognizing a predator's voice, with the ancestral memory that slept in human DNA and woke only in the presence of true danger. The Ushioni was not calling for food. It was not calling for freedom. It was calling for something else, something that had been waiting much longer than 47 days, something that had been waiting perhaps since before humans had learned to fear the dark. "Security," Dr. Voss whispered into her radio, but her voice was drowned out by a new sound, a sound that came not from the pod but from the walls, from the pipes, from the very infrastructure of the facility. It was a skittering, a clicking, a rhythmic tapping of multiple limbs against metal and ceramic and concrete, moving through the plumbing and ventilation with the confidence of something that knew every inch of its territory. The sound came from above, from below, from the east and the west, a surround sound symphony of arachnid locomotion that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. Dr. Voss turned to run, but the door to the observation chamber was already sealed, locked by a fail-safe protocol that she had not triggered, that no one had triggered, that had engaged itself in response to sensors she had not known existed. Through the reinforced glass of the pod, the Ushioni watched her with its red eyes, and in their wet depths she saw not hunger but satisfaction, not rage but completion. It had never been alone. It had never been a solitary predator. It was part of a network, a colony, a civilization that had existed in the deep places of the earth long before humans had dug their first well, and its capture had been not a defeat but a delivery. The sound in the pipes grew louder, closer, multiplying into a chorus of clicking and skittering that seemed to vibrate the very molecules of the air. Dr. Voss pressed her back against the sealed door, her notebook falling from numb fingers, her breath coming in shallow gasps that she could not control. The Ushioni in the pod opened its mandibles fully, and this time the sound that emerged was the bellow of the ox, but transformed, modulated, directed through the facility's infrastructure with the precision of a radio signal tuned to a specific receiver. And from the cooling vents above her head, from the water pipes behind the walls, from the waste conduits beneath the floor, came the answering bellow. Dozens of them. Hundreds. The sound of a colony waking, of a network activating, of an invasion beginning not from without but from within, from the pipes and the ducts and the spaces between the walls where humans never thought to look. The glass of the observation window cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked in a spiderweb pattern that radiated from a single point where something had struck it from the other side. Dr. Voss looked up, following the sound, and saw what had made the crack. A leg, segmented and armored, ending in a hooked barb that glowed with fresh venom, retracting now into the ventilation shaft from which it had emerged. It was smaller than the Ushioni's limbs, perhaps half the size, but it was identical in structure, identical in purpose, and it was only the first. The lights in the facility flickered. The emergency alarms engaged, then fell silent, overridden by systems that had been compromised from within. Dr. Voss slid down the door until she sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes fixed on the cracked glass and the pod beyond it. The Ushioni stared back, and in its gaze there was no mercy, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of human significance. There was only the patient certainty of something that had waited through ages, that had allowed itself to be captured and transported and studied, also that it could map the facility, learn its weaknesses, and summon its kind to a feast that would begin with the inhabitants of this bunker and spread, inexorably, to the surface world above. The skittering in the pipes grew louder, and then closer, and then it was no longer in the pipes but in the walls, in the ceiling, in the floor beneath her feet. Dr. Voss closed her eyes and thought of sunlight, of the Nevada desert above, of a world that did not yet know what was coming. She thought of Kaido and Hana, somewhere in their reconstructed lives, and she wondered if they had heard the sound yet, if they knew that their victory in the valley had been nothing but the first move in a game they did not understand. The glass cracked again, and this time it did not stop cracking. The skittering became a rush, a waterfall of legs and mandibles and red eyes pouring through the breach, and Dr. Voss opened her mouth to scream but found that she had forgotten how, that her terror had reached a frequency beyond sound, beyond vibration, beyond the physics of fear that the Ushi-Oni hunted. In the pod, the original specimen, the scout, the vanguard, watched the feeding begin with the stillness of a monarch observing the opening of Parliament. It did not join the feast. It did not need to. The colony would feed. The colony would grow. And when the facility was empty, when the bones were arranged in new geometries of worship and warning, the colony would follow the pipes upward, into the desert, into the cities, into the places where humans walked without looking down, without listening to the water, without noticing that the rivers had begun, in certain remote valleys, to flow upward once again. The last thing Dr. Voss saw, before the darkness took her with the gentleness of a mother's hand, was the Ushi-Oni's eyes glowing in the artificial twilight of the breached chamber, 2 red stars in a constellation that had no name in any human sky, burning with the promise that the inversion was not an anomaly but a beginning, and that the river's reversal had been not a local curiosity but a harbinger of a tide that would soon engulf the world. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.